World Discussion with Agent Smith. Are you ready for the World Discussion with Agent Smith?
It's a bit of a different intro than usual, but I can still do this. And then we start. Today is October the 30th, 2022, and we're here to talk about the world, what's going on. Chat is already like, Brazil! So we're probably going to talk about that. Without further ado, I will jump into chat here. This is meant to be an active conversation, so if anyone has questions, comments, corrections, feel free to share, and he will read those after the show. Agent Smith.
Hey, how are you?
Solid, strong. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing okay.
I'm enjoying the nice turn of the weather. I did a joke 1-minute video walking around on side about how they added a new red tree skin. So we're getting
Red
those
tree skin.
Yeah, we're getting autumn here. I know you're still in the Texas summer.
Yeah, it did cool down a little bit recently, but yeah, it's still been pretty warm lately.
Yeah. I'll be getting to visit family on the Oregon coast this coming week, which will be fun. Just a few days there at the beach to hang out, chill, relax. The chat is already buzzing about stuff happening this week, specifically 2 hours ago, Brazil election results.
Oh, yeah.
And then we have one question already in the chat, which is, what is the purpose of NATO nowadays? NATO gets mentioned a lot, I think, because Russia warns a lot about NATO.
Oh, yeah. They're very nefarious people, don't you know?
Yeah.
What is the purpose of NATO? You know, that's a tricky question, because that's something that leaders within NATO member states have kind of grappled with over the past couple decades. You know, obviously it was originally designed to combat and deter the Soviet Union from a potential invasion, i.e. World War III. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a lot of soul searching within NATO as an organization to find a new raison d'etre, so to speak. And, in the 90s, it was kind of, to a degree, peacekeeping. It was involved in the Yugoslav interventions, for example. And it was also seen as a useful diplomatic tool to ensure peace between member states. The organization was mostly meant to deter the Soviets, but it also had a kind of implicit secondary mission of ensuring peace in Europe by ensuring most of the member states did not have any kind of, well, at least that the member states had a disincentive, shall we say, to go to war with each other, since that would have threatened their membership and possibly brought in other members against them. That's not as relevant for, say, the Netherlands and Belgium, which are not really threatening anybody, but for, say, Greece and Turkey, for example, that secondary mission is actually pretty useful. Tensions between them are not infrequently sour, to put it mildly. And they've been particularly rocky the past couple months. Just tensions over islands and things like that. There's an election next year in Turkey, so, that's generally what happens when an election is pending. People start making signals and whatnot about how tough they are. But anyway, in the 90s, it was diplomatic and peacemaking. Those were sort of the principal purposes, so to speak. But there was a lot of debate about it even then. Nobody really had a clear answer. It kind of existed more on momentum left over from the Cold War than anything. Obviously, in the aughts, after 2001, it became more counterterrorism. They started focusing more on assisting, say, the United States in Afghanistan, and also cooperating on general counterterrorism within Europe and the periphery around Europe. But I think Afghanistan was probably the main thing they were doing after 2001. Sort of around 2010 afterwards, when the intervention started sort of ending, more or less. Libya was in 2011, but still by 2010, it was pretty clear support for interventions was dwindling. And so there came to be less support for that. And there came to be more questions about NATO's purpose again. And sort of 2014, in the events in Ukraine, kind of resolved that. There was a lot of countries, especially in Eastern Europe, who were NATO members, who pointed at the whole Crimean thing, whatever you want to call it, the Donbass War, the Crimean intervention, whatever, or whatever other preferred name you may have. In 2014, that really sold a lot of Eastern European states that Russia was a renewed threat. And mind you, a lot of Eastern European states never stopped thinking of Russia as a threat and have been encouraging their Western partners to focus more on it. So 2014 settled the issue, and NATO started to shift more towards focus on Russia again afterwards, although it didn't have a lot of momentum in doing so until the invasion of Ukraine in February of this year, 2022. So the 2010s were definitely a period of flux for NATO and its purpose, but over time it was clear there was a shift back towards a focus on Russia. And that seems to be where we're going right now in the 2020s. So I would say that's the purpose then right now of NATO, just deterring Russia at this point. But it's very much variable. It's not fixed like it was during the Cold War. It's very much subject to debate, and I would say is pretty malleable depending on circumstances. Overall, I think really it never stopped being, first and foremost, a diplomatic tool to hold together allies in Europe and try to maintain the peace between members. That's probably the one constant factor and the one valuable factor that has really kept the alliance together over time. Because whatever else happens, that's always a useful feature.
There's a follow-up question. Was the invasion a result of a 2014 coup that ousted a democratically elected leader?
Oh, God. you know, that's one of those questions that people are going to argue about forever. We'll be old men and we'll still hear people arguing about that. I'm a little skeptical that it was a coup, per se. It looked very similar to a lot of popular protests and uprisings that have occurred in the region over time. But of course, from the perspective of Russians, certainly Russian nationalists, and not a few people in the United States and in the West generally, color revolutions have a very negative connotation to them that kind of implicitly suggests Western subterfuge of some kind. So there's been a lot of suspicion and paranoia in those particular quarters about just what the cause of those revolutions was, up to and including the Euromaidan revolt in Ukraine. So whether or not that was the result of a conniving West out to pry Ukraine out of the Russian sphere of influence, or whether it was the result of mismanagement by a corrupt Ukrainian government alienating its people, or a third option, maybe it was just Russia being really bad at managing their sphere of influence and alienating people themselves, which is what I personally think is the case. Whatever you think is the case, these are all debatable. So I can't really give you a concrete answer that you will find satisfying. Because again, there's a lot of countervailing evidence and a lot of details that people can't agree on. And part of it just comes down to sheer subjectivity. Invariably, some people won't be convinced no matter what you tell them. They're invariably fixed in their mistrust of the West or of Russia or of whomever, such that they can't see Euromaidan in any other way than that which they do. So I'm not your mother. I'm not here to tell you what to believe, but I will tell you that it is an ambiguous event, shall we say. Very debatable.
And as we mentioned with the show, every news source has a bias, including us. and we're just here to talk about stuff. So there's always stuff that we haven't factored in, and we're both Americans talking about this. So we're going to have at least a bias toward reading news written in English and that kind of thing.
Well, maybe I misread the question a little bit. They were speaking about, was the invasion a result of the 24? So which invasion are we talking about? I assumed the invasion they were referring to was the 2014 invasion, but some people don't consider that an invasion. Some people consider that a domestic Russian uprising in eastern Ukraine. So maybe the invasion they're talking about was the recent one in 2022. I would ask for clarification on that particular point, because I guess the answer would depend on it. Did you enjoy my text message?
Yes, I got your food order. I wasn't able to fulfill that for you because you're very far away.
Yeah, that was embarrassing.
It's all good. Yeah, I got a message from Agent Smith earlier in the day of his food order. I guess you had like our text conversation open or something and you just sent it to me.
Yeah. I was thinking about asking you if you were going to skip today, because I remembered you said you were going to skip soon or something.
Yeah, it'll be the next one, I think.
The next one. Okay, that's
Yeah.
what it was. But then I thought better of it and decided not to bother you. But then as a result, like you say, your contact was already open, and 99% of the time, the contacts I already have open are the people I, talk to, specifically family members.
Mm-hmm.
So we were going to go get something to eat. So I sent them the order. Or at least I thought I did. I realized when they didn't get it that I'd sent it to you, which again, embarrassing.
It happens.
Would you believe they forgot my sandwich?
Did they? Wow.
They did. It was flustering. I paid for it and everything.
I saw it in the message. That was definitely part of it. So I can I can confirm you didn't forget it.
Yeah, that was a little flustering.
You've got eyewitness testimony here.
So I hope Popeye's Chicken enjoys the $6 donation I made to their bottom line this year. Well played. Oh, was there anything that kind of caught your eye that you wanted to touch on? I think you mentioned Brazil earlier.
There were like 9 people who mentioned Brazil in the chat so far, so maybe we could.
Yeah, I knew that the election was today, but I didn't know when the results would be finalized. Apparently, they're already in.
Yeah.
You mentioned it, and I looked up BBC, and apparently they called it for Lula.
Yeah.
That is to say, Lula da Silva, who was the left-wing candidate. So, unless Bolsonaro wants to do some dirty tricks of some kind, then it looks like he's going to be out of power.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a big if, because he's kind of been telegraphing with some of his statements over the past year that he would try to do something if it looked like he was going to lose. So I'm going to be keeping my eye on that next 24 hours. The election may not be over, so to speak, but if everything goes according to plan, and if in fact the results are legitimate, then Lula da Silva will replace Bolsonaro. That'll be good news for Washington. I think da Silva was their preferred candidate. Mm-hmm. And it'll be good news for the northeast of Brazil, which I think is more Lula's base of support. That's the poorer part of Brazil. It's predominantly populated by people who are descended more from the slaves who were imported. Mm-hmm. Way back in the 1700s, etc. And the region's never really recovered from that economically. So there's generally a lot of support for left-wing candidates there. I think he did promise to raise the minimum wage. I think the article I was reading mentioned that, and unsurprisingly, he promised to try to cut back on deforestation in the Amazon. I'm pretty deeply skeptical they'll be able to do that, but we'll see. Brazil is a relatively developed country as far as developing countries in South America go, but state capacity is relatively limited, especially in the Amazon. Mm-hmm. So I don't really know how much the government can realistically do to actually curtail deforestation. That's especially going to be the case if there's a major global economic downturn. That'll be very deleterious for the government's budget. In that sense, governing Brazil at this point could be a kind of poison pill. No doubt, whichever new government takes power is going to be blamed for whatever economic downturn is coming. So they may regret winning in the end, but we'll see. If nothing else, it'll be a breath of fresh air for people who are sort of tired of Bolsonaro's antics.
Mm-hmm.
So things might quiet down in that regard. But that might be an optimistic take. Again, he could try to stick around to some degree. All open questions. Remains to be seen. Not exactly the most exciting commentary. But the election literally just ended, so we'll see. That's all I really can say.
Some people will like this, others won't.
Yeah, the real thing I'm watching for is if Bolsonaro claims election fraud. That's the one I'm most interested in. Beyond that, I don't know how much the new government under Lula da Silva, if it does in fact take power, will actually be able to change.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think there will be much sexy going on in that regard.
Not sexy outcomes in the Brazil election.
Yeah. Yeah, if you want excitement, you really have to follow Peru's politics. They've got a lot more going on, as I'm sure anybody from Peru can attest. I think the last thing I was reading is that the legislature was trying to suspend the president. Is that what it was? They stopped trying to impeach him. That wasn't working, but they did find this other weird approach that they could take to try to clip his wings that involved somehow suspending him to some degree. And I think he also, that is to say, the president changed his cabinet again. I think he's changed his cabinet every couple months since he won power. Lots of unrest in Peru's politics over the past 4 years. It's been a while. It actually started back with Odebrecht several years ago. I think that was kind of just starting to unfold when we first started this segment back in 2017 or so. So Peru's been a pretty consistent feature of my news feed since then.
Mm.
Oh, did we ever talk about Chile's constitution? The one that they voted not to implement?
Yeah, you said it failed to pass.
Yeah. Did not work. Let's see. So maybe I could just talk briefly about some of the provisions that were in it, just to kind of illustrate some of the aspects that were controversial, shall we say. So just a couple of provisions that were in some articles I read. There was one provision stipulating that all public institutions would have to have gender parity, presumably in terms of employees and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
It also laid the groundwork for national public health care, and it made the government responsible for adapting to and mitigating the effects of climate change. That's a short list, just 3 items. I think I had another list here somewhere with more, but basically the gist of it is that there was a lot of churn in the negotiations around the new constitution amongst the members of the Constitutional Assembly.
Mm-hmm.
So there was lots of changes and lots of infighting, lots of bad blood, you might say. And the result is that a lot of people are soured on it over time, up to and including some of the people who nominally supported it. So some of the controversial elements, which very much represented overreach in some cases. It was a very, very ambitious document, and by the time they finished with it, that all resulted in ultimately the people voting it down.
Mm-hmm. The gender parity one, does that mean you have to have 1-to-1 ratio?
I believe so, yeah.
Mm.
Which would be difficult. Let me see if I can find the other notes on that. Well, anyway, Chile has been trying to figure out what to do since the Constitution was voted down. And they still want to try to make some changes. There's still kind of a popular mandate to implement changes and reforms, but it seems pretty clear that constitutional convention is not going to be the way they do that. So they are still going to try to make some changes, but it's going to be via constitutional amendments by way of the legislature. I think that's what I remember reading about it anyway. So that'll probably mean a much narrower range of changes and reforms to the Constitution, but those changes will probably be more popular and are much more likely to pass, unlike some of the broader ranging stuff that was in the Constitution they drew up before. Let me try this. I've got links to notepad files in my notepad files, Neuro.
Yo, dog, I heard you like notepad files, so I put a notepad file link in your notepad file.
That's what it comes down to. I had a whole long thing about Chile, and I don't know what I did with it. I'll have to dig that up. God knows what I did with it. What else has been going on? There was some corruption scandals in Paraguay that could affect the presidential election, but from what I was reading, it was almost entirely within the ruling party, which is probably just going to stay in power regardless of who wins the power struggle. So not a lot of change coming there. Paraguay doesn't get a lot of coverage. It's a very small country. Probably the biggest economic driver there is the huge-ass dam they built with Brazilian assistance. They're apparently about to finish paying off the loan that they took out to help build that dam. So they'll finally be able to free up a good chunk of the budget, which had been paying off the interest for the loan, as well as the principal. And so there's been some debate about what to do with that new money that's going to be freed up. Argentina is still a mess, and I apologize to Dagnip. It's been way too long since I got back to him. For a while, I was kind of waiting to see if there would be more, because I wasn't sure if he was finished. He kind of left it a little ambiguous as to whether he would write more. But eventually, I just kind of forgot for a while. So I am still going to try to respond to him on that. But yeah, Argentina is still messy, to put it mildly. I think inflation is up to 100% per year now. It's quite high. It's not going well there. I think Mexico is still locked in negotiations with the United States as far as, I always want to call it NAFTA, but I guess it's USMCA now, which is a goofy name. NAFTA is much easier to remember. USMCA, well, for those of you who don't know what NAFTA is, NAFTA was the North American Free Trade Agreement. That was a free trade deal the United States signed with Mexico and Canada. And the Trump administration famously made it a priority to renegotiate that agreement, along with many other free trade agreements the United States has, in order to engineer new trade agreements that were ostensibly more favorable to the United States. In practice, what they did was just basically renegotiate the agreements to be exactly as they were, but with a couple new provisions that added on to them. So in some cases, they actually made the free trade agreements better, which is not what people were expecting. There was a sense the Trump administration was very anti-free trade, but in the case of NAFTA, they actually just strengthened some of the enforcement provisions and also expanded some of the trade provisions to encompass digital trade, which the previous agreement had not done. So overall, it was actually something of an improvement, which again was not what was expected. That people were expecting more trade diversion, basically more protectionism, certain provisions to be shot down, and trade to just generally be curtailed. So the Trump administration kind of surprised on that count. Maybe it should not have. That was kind of the general trend for a lot of the renegotiations. It kind of seemed after a while like they were renegotiating for the sake of renegotiating. They really didn't, again, change a whole lot. Most of the agreements were just slightly modified. So in the case of NAFTA, it was renegotiated into a new agreement, which was called the USMCA, which was the United States, Mexico, Canada Agreement, which is a horrifically bland name for any trade agreement, but that's what we've got. So I guess that's what I'm supposed to call it. And one of the provisions, well, among the provisions in the USMCA, which I think was a holdover from NAFTA, was non-discrimination. You're not supposed to discriminate against foreign firms in any way. And it gets kind of unclear as far as actually operationalizing that, because there's some rules that you can implement which are nominally done for, say, environmental reasons or for regulatory reasons or, whatever, which can be for one purpose, but which have kind of an implicit, perhaps inadvertent side effect of disproportionately impacting foreign firms. So in those cases, the question arises, did the government in question implement such a policy that discriminated against foreign firms accidentally or inadvertently, or did they do it on purpose and are just pretending to have done it inadvertently so that they can get the benefits of access to, say, US markets without having to suffer from exposing their own markets to foreign competition? So questions like that resulted in things like, rules of origin agreements and non-discrimination agreements in specific sectors and that kind of stuff. And the Mexican government, more recently, in the past, 2 years or so, if not before, has been in some difficult negotiations with the United States over allegations that the Mexican government has been discriminating against American firms in Mexican markets. So the energy sector has probably been the main focus of those negotiations. The government under AMLO, President Obrador, who was sort of a left populist, shall we say, who came to power in Mexico a couple of years ago, has really prioritized the renationalization of Mexico's energy sector. He's kind of been taking it slow. He hasn't done it like in one fell swoop like he could have. He's kind of trying to take it easy so he can avoid antagonizing foreign investors, and also probably doesn't want to destabilize Mexico's own energy market. But the result has been foreign energy firms, mostly American, who have felt the squeeze, so to speak, from the Mexican government, as they've done little things here and there to try to squeeze them out of the market and to try to restore what had been a monopoly before the 1990s by a company called Pemex, which was a state-owned oil company that was largely responsible for much of Mexico's energy sector through much of the 20th century. Yeah, they had written into their own constitution in the early 20th century that Pemex should never be privatized, but then in the 90s they kind of revised that. They're still technically not allowed to privatize it, but they are allowed to sell shares in Pemex in order to try to attract foreign investment and foreign expertise, which is what they did. But that was very unpopular from some quarters of Mexico's left wing. That is to say, the left wing of Mexico's politics, as well as probably some people on the nationalist right wing. And so Obrador has been trying to delay or deny licenses to foreign energy firms. Hypothetically, he could just outright nationalize their assets, but that seems to be kind of a nuclear option they don't really want to implement. The effects have been mixed. There's been issues with energy in Mexico since they started doing this. And there's been intermittent stories of accidents, from smugglers and whatnot, owing to shortages and, other problems that stem from government regulation of the sector. But the government seems set on it, and so the result has been something of a a diplomatic standoff, if you will, with the United States, and to a lesser degree, Canada. It's kind of bad timing. Whatever the merits of nationalizing the energy sector may be, it's kind of scared investors a little bit. And right now, one of the big trends internationally is that a lot of manufacturers and investors are trying to find ways to decouple their supply chains from mostly China, but to a degree, there's also been an effort to reshore generally from sources that are on the other side of the planet to sources that are closer to home. And so that led to some speculation that Mexico could be a major beneficiary, since Mexico obviously is directly adjacent to the largest market on the planet. So hypothetically, some of that reshoring could have gone to Mexico, but it may be that investors are sufficiently concerned over the Mexican government's commitment to non-discrimination that they may aver and prefer to send that business to other places, probably places in Central America or the Caribbean, which have freestanding bilateral trade agreements with the United States. We'll see how all that shakes out. Maybe investors are not sufficiently scared to avoid investing in Mexico. Or maybe it doesn't matter either way. It could be that there's just a more attractive investment locale outside of Mexico anyway. Or maybe some people prefer just going into the United States directly. Although, given how expensive labor is here, I don't know how likely that is, but it's possible. So all of that remains to be seen. But for now, at least, it's created some schism there between Washington and Mexico City. I think there's been more protests in Cuba, too.
Protesting
Yeah,
what?
that has to do... Huh?
Protesting what?
Just economic conditions. They were already pretty bad during the pandemic. But since then, inflation has been causing problems as well. Cuba depends disproportionately on... well, I should say the Cuban economy depends disproportionately on tourism and sugar, as well as, tobacco and certain other items. So none of those industries have really performed particularly strongly since the pandemic. Obviously, tourism struggled mightily during pandemic travel restrictions in 2020, but even during 2021, a lot of those restrictions were still in place, and after they were lifted, there was not a lot of takers. It's recovered a bit since then, but now the problem is things like energy, which is a major input that influences the cost of production for just about everything in the economy. So that's squeezed Cuba in particular because their ability to pay for expensive imports, such as refined gasoline and other refined fuels, is relatively limited. So the Cuban economy and the Cuban people have been disproportionately impacted, and the result has been renewed protests. Nothing too large. I haven't really read anything about mass protests like the ones that happened, what was it, last year, I guess. But they have been persistent, intermittent, but persistent. So there is some question as to the potential for those protests to spiral out into something larger. I have no doubt that the Cuban government is keeping an eye on that in that vein.
What is the type of government that Cuba has?
Short answer, communist. They've still got a communist government left over from the revolution in the 50s. If you want me to get more specific than that, it's a one-party state. They do not allow opposition or dissidents, for that matter. I think there's probably some that's kind of accepted within certain bounds. And those bounds have expanded a little bit over the past 10 years, but by and large, no, they don't really allow true dissidents. You can kind of criticize, well, not even criticize, but you can critique the party to a degree. And local corruption is a viable target, depending on how connected the local politicians are.
Yeah, you mentioned that about China. You're allowed to criticize government as long as it's local government and not the Chinese Communist Party.
Yeah, that's the thing. If you want to advocate for an actual change in party or a change in government or broader constitutional changes or legal changes, that stuff is more taboo within the context of their political culture. So that doesn't happen so much. I think Puerto Rico was hit by a hurricane. They were hurting pretty hard from that. But I think coverage hasn't really been very persistent. It's kind of similar to when they were hit during the Trump administration. They lost power and were in pretty dire need for a pretty prolonged period of time. It looks like they're repeating the experience.
Damn.
Yeah, it's been a pretty busy news cycle the past year, so I think they kind of got crowded out this time. Let's see, that's the Western Hemisphere. I don't know what's going on in Canada. I don't think anything exciting is going on in Canada, but that doesn't mean that there isn't anything exciting happening, just that I haven't read enough about it. But it hasn't been on my radar lately, so I think people have been behaving there. I assume housing costs are still the preeminent issue, but that's a guess on my part, without having read more about it.
There was this map on Reddit that was the country that people would most like to migrate to, and tons of people said Canada in that one. So I don't know if it's the climate being cool or the culture being pretty like welcoming and diverse. Definitely one of the places that's going to be more and more expensive to live in as certain places get too hot.
Yeah, it's multicultural, so it's a little more accepting of immigrants. You know, immigrants are a disproportionately large proportion of Canada's population because they have a relatively open regime, and the economy is decent. Standard of living is high, you know, so it's a very attractive candidate for a lot of people. Also, gateway communities are pretty prominent. You know, when enough people from a given country migrate to another country, they tend to coalesce together into little communities. And if those communities are successful, word of that success reaches friends and relatives back in the home country. And that tends to attract even more people, generally to the specific gateway community in question. So Canada has a pretty decent number of those, and they've done pretty well. I guess it's not Canada per se, but I have read about more people trying to migrate illegally into the United States from places like India more recently, which surprised me. You know, historically, migrants trying to illegally cross the southern border have done so, well, have been disproportionately from Latin America, you know, generally Mexico or maybe Central America. But recently, there's been a pretty significant uptick in people from places like India or even Africa. It's pretty unusual. Some of it just has to do with declining economic conditions in those places. You know, they've been getting squeezed by energy costs and the pandemic and all the other exogenous, exciting bullshit that's been happening in the global economy over the past couple of years. But also successful gateway communities have been attracting more people as well. So push and pull factors, if you will.
When people migrate illegally to the US from places that aren't Latin America, are they like flying over for quote travel and then just not going home?
No, they actually have been flying into Mexico or perhaps even other places in Latin America and then trying to literally cross the border. It's not the usual. You're correct that most people who are in the United States illegally, in terms of their residency status or what have you, do so by overstaying a visa. You know, so that's correct. But what I'm saying is that there are literally people from outside Latin America illegally crossing the border, like the Rio Grande, and it's highly unusual. Like, as you mentioned, normally people from like India or Africa will just come in on a visa, but the newer cohort, I guess, if you can call it that, have actually been trying to cross the border. And again, that just comes down to push and pull factors. I would point out here that it's still not very many people overall. You know, the vast majority are still from the Americas. It's just that the percentage increase, you know, has been relatively high. So we've gone from a very low number to still a very low number. But it's like several thousand to something like 10,000, you know, number of people from, say, India, for example. It's a noticeable increase. It's, you know, unusual, but still a very, very small minority relative to the overall numbers coming across, most of which, again, are from Latin America. Yeah, from what I read, there's people, well, in India's case, what they'll do is they'll fly into like South America somewhere, and then they'll actually either fly to Mexico or even just walk as best they can, maybe hitching a ride on a train or something. In Africa, I've heard of people from Ethiopia traveling down to Malawi, which is sort of south of Ethiopia in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And then from there, human traffickers will smuggle them basically to locations in the Americas somewhere, from which they'll travel north to the border and try to get in there. So they're leaning really heavily on smuggling networks, basically. It's not the typical case of just getting a visa. These people can't even get that, and so they default to more desperate measures, you might say. It's a very dangerous journey. I was reading in the news just the other week about a mass grave of Ethiopian migrants being discovered in Malawi. People who had been killed by opportunistic smugglers or perhaps other gangsters looking to take advantage of them. Human trafficking is as big a business as ever, unfortunately. It comes with many, many casualties.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons why people don't realize how big of a problem it is because it often happens to people who are in that kind of vulnerable travel state and they're not rooted somewhere. Like, you don't usually hear about friends or family being kidnapped and taken hostage, at least not in the US.
Yeah.
But in some places, what was it? Is it Colombia or something? Venezuela, I think, where like kidnapping is super common.
It's not as bad as it used to be. I think Mexico has been catching up in that regard. Colombia is getting better. Urban Brazil has a lot of problems in that regard. Although I think that's been getting better too. But yeah, there's definitely Haiti probably is the worst right now. Haiti's basically on the verge of becoming a failed state, if it isn't already. But yeah, it's a point well taken.
Haiti has had protests recently too.
Protests are the least of their problems.
Oh.
They've had protests, but weirdly, the protests have been against the government, which is almost pointless given how weak the government is there at this point. After the assassination last year of the president, there was a lot of instability. And what happened is that the larger, more powerful gangs in Haiti basically took over. And they've effectively been waging a series of wars against each other for control of key infrastructure and other valuable territory from which they extract revenue. It's gotten to the point where people can't even really get fuel or aid because the routes along which the fuel and aid normally travel are heavily patrolled, if you like, by gangs of one sort or another, which steal and or tax the material passing along them. It's specifically because of that difficulty, which has exacerbated already bad inflation in the country, that the protests happened. But again, I don't see what the Haitian government can even really do about it at this point. The Haitian economy is a mess, and global inflationary forces have just made that so much worse. And the instability that came after the assassination last year has resulted in a severely debilitated state, even worse than it already was. So at this point, the powers that be are effectively the gangs. And it actually got bad enough that there was one minister of parliament, was it? I think it was, a politician in Haiti somewhere who actually went online and requested that the United States intervene in Haiti in order to help reestablish order in the country, which was very controversial because it's not as though we haven't done that before. And so Haitian nationalists in particular really resented the idea that the United States should be invited in to help restore order. But even the idea that we would try to do that at all is just very controversial given the history. So that's not going to happen, and the United States government, for its part, is not looking for another foreign intervention. The Biden administration is kind of setting its mark by trying to avoid them, Ukraine notwithstanding. So I think Haiti is kind of on its own in that regard. There's been, I think, some more foreign aid, but again, without any kind of substantive order on the ground, it's not going to do much good. Pretty much just free meals and pay for warlords at this point. So yeah, kidnapping is probably worse in Haiti at this point than most anywhere else in the Western Hemisphere.
I saw a documentary of a guy who was trying to go through Haiti and do a tour and stuff, and tourism was really big there at certain points, but because it's so dangerous, like the tourism is way down, plus COVID.
Yeah.
And it's really hard to just drive around the country as well, because there will be protests where they like blow up a bus or something and just leave it in the middle of the road. And the local area doesn't really have good people that can just go clear that and stuff, and kind of like that politician was saying, maintain some semblance of order. It's very chaotic there.
Unfortunately, so it doesn't look set to get much better.
I would guess that there have been some other places in history that kind of had a similar issue of they were gang ruled, and then eventually some regime was able to establish the monopoly on violence. That's one of the things that's actually tricky, because it involves you being able to just overpower these thugs basically and establish control of the area. What you do with that power can still be evil, but for them to have power is like almost always evil, because it's just at their discretion, and they don't usually have as many norms and systems in place to make sure that they don't abuse their power.
Well, pretty much all peoples and history, well, pretty much all peoples and nations have origins in that kind of genesis. You know, everybody came out of the Hobbesian state, so to speak. It was always warring tribes fighting with each other at some point in a given country's history. So everybody experienced that at some point. It was in the more distant past for some nations, more so than in others. But nobody can deny that it was the state of affairs, so to speak, at one point. The Western Hemisphere is kind of a weird gray area on that count, because basically we're sort of the western frontier of Western civilization. So we kind of had states already from the start, in so much as European states governed the spaces here. But that governance was always pretty weak, too. And it definitely proceeded in some regions before others. So to a degree, we were kind of, what's the word I want, endowed with strong institutions from the start. But we also kind of had to build them ourselves to a degree, just in order to kind of establish the kinds of centralized government that Europe had from the start. So it's a little bit of a different history, and that partly accounts for why the political culture in the Western Hemisphere is different so much from Europe. You know, the United States obviously has a different political culture than the rest of, say, Latin America. But we also have things in common. You know, in general, everybody in the Western Hemisphere generally has weaker governance. Just broadly speaking, not necessarily bad governance, but less centralized governments and states are more common in the Western Hemisphere than they are in Europe. And that's partly a legacy of just how decentralized colonial governments were. Just inevitably, like there was no other type of government. Well, there was no other type of colonial government than a weak decentralized government, because that was all they had the administrative capacity for. I think I talked a bit, last week or maybe a couple weeks ago about some colonial Latin American history, and how the Spanish Empire had really not so much an empire in the Western Hemisphere, so much as nodes of governance in which their power was concentrated, and outside of which their authority was very limited. So that inherently lent itself to relatively weak governance and relatively broad discretion on the part of local elites. You know, in the United States, we were fortunate because our colonial political culture and overall political economy was more tightly ingrained with sort of some of the Enlightenment movements in Europe. And so we were able to end up with a government and governing system that was more defined by Enlightenment values. In other parts of Latin America, they had revolutionaries who were successfully able to overturn Spanish rule and establish liberal governments. But in practice, a lot of those governments just ended up being more or less a continuation of the previous colonial government, only with less oversight from a foreign power, which had been the case before.
I guess most European governments are more friendly to opposition than like these communist governments we mentioned. Like you're allowed to have multiple parties and so on.
In Europe?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, ever since the end of the Cold War, liberal democracy has been the basically only acceptable form of government in Europe. To not embrace it has resulted invariably in a not inconsiderable degree of ostracizing on the part of the broader European community. Reversals on that count have resulted in no small amount of angst within European Union politics, Hungary being the preeminent example, and to a lesser degree, Poland. Russia, I guess, is the current example, but they never fully made that transition in the first place, so I don't know how high expectations really were.
Mm.
And they were never integrated into the European Union. So it's much more serious from the perspective of liberal Democrats in Europe that, say, a European Union member like Hungary has rescinded on promises vis-a-vis liberal democratic governance than, say, Russia, which never made such promises and was not really bound to respect any.
Illiberal democracy? Do you still say democracy?
Highly debatable. Technically, it is still democratic. It's just not very, well, I mean, as the name implies, it's not liberal. And whether or not that's a good or bad thing depends on your thoughts on liberalism. And before chat loses its shit, I'll remind once again that when I say liberal, I'm talking about what in the United States is referred to as classical liberalism. That is sort of the bedrock of American political culture, as well as much of Western civilization generally over the past 5 centuries. So liberalism in that sense refers to political pluralism, relatively laissez-faire economics, rule of law, independent judiciaries, the whole package of liberal democracy, so to speak. It's the kind of stuff that you kind of take for granted if you grow up in a developed country. Sort of the hard wiring, if you like, of liberal democratic institutions. That stuff is not a given. It had to be created. At one point, it was even radical, and there was no shortage of wars and rebellions fought over it. Now it's so boring that you barely think about it.
Yeah, I was trying to, in a similar vein, think about some stuff that I have that I take for granted every day. And one of the ones for me as a broadcaster is I have a chat that I like. I like the people who are there. I like the way that they talk to each other basically all the time. And there are a lot of content creators and broadcasters that have more of an edgy culture to how they talk, and then their chat as a result is also edgy. And if the streamer is bashing people and stuff pretty often, then the chat will also do that and sometimes bash the streamer. So streamers can sometimes feel scared or intimidated to stream because of that. But we have a great chat here. So thanks, chat, for your participation. Also, Agent Smith does read the chat after, so if we say anything silly, you can just laugh at us and give us a correction. It's fine.
Yeah, I guess that's the cue for the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. And as Neuro mentioned, if I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. So feedback is certainly appreciated.
Belarus was mentioned. They have a dictatorship now, right?
Oh, they've had one since the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union.
Oh.
Although I guess it was kind of debatable whether or not it was a dictatorship from the start. Lukashenko was the first president of independent Belarus. And maybe it was not entirely clear in those early days that he was going to be dictator, but I don't think he wasted a lot of time in establishing his hold over government. So for the most part, yeah, he's been running a dictatorship since the early 90s. Yeah, they haven't been in the news too much, although they were in the news a little bit this past week. But that has to do with Ukraine. Did you want to do the update?
Sure, let's do it.
Well, Belarus was in the news because there were reports of Russian military forces, specifically the Russian army, deploying some units into Belarus, and that led to some speculation that maybe a new offensive into Ukraine might be launched from Belarus, akin to the one that was launched towards Kiev at the beginning of the war back in February. Hypothetically, that's possible, but from what I was reading online amongst analysts, it seems unlikely. For one, Belarus itself, even if there were an offensive, almost certainly would not participate. They've been transferring a lot of heavy equipment to Russia, up to and including 90 some main battle tanks, presumably in order to help them out. They've obviously been suffering in the Russian army from equipment shortages, owing to losses and abandonment and whatnot. So that's kind of left the Belarusian military with some shortages. Also, the Belarusian government has been very, very shy about getting itself involved in the war in Ukraine. It's already kind of gotten itself into trouble just for hosting Russian military forces and allowing them to invade Ukraine from their territory. And it seems Lukashenko is not interested in sort of exacerbating those tensions with Western Europe. You know, as we've talked about before, Lukashenko has an alliance with Russia. You know, Belarus is a CSTO member state, but any dictator knows not to be too dependent on any one partner. It's dangerous because it increases leverage to a dangerous degree and could result in your partner potentially removing you from power, which isn't good for you, obviously. So Lukashenko, over the past couple decades, has generally tried to balance Russian influence with European influence, or should I say European Union influence, however you want to phrase that. That kind of ran into some serious headwinds in 2021 because of mass protests that broke out, famously so. You know, we talked about them at the time, as people were upset about a fraudulent election that the government orchestrated, you might say. And the result is that the European Union put sanctions on Belarus and otherwise significantly curtailed ties, with the result that Belarus had to lean very heavily on Russian support in order to kind of make it through those protests, which they did successfully. But that left Lukashenko sort of in debt, if you like, to Vladimir Putin. And that's probably a big reason why Belarus ended up hosting Russian military forces for the invasion in 2022. Now, let's see. That being the case, Lukashenko is probably now trying to kind of rebalance a little bit. He's not going to kick the Russians out. That's probably a bridge too far at this point. But he is going to try to stop the bleeding, so to speak, diplomatically. He's going to try to ensure that Belarus is not sucked into the conflict, so that it still has some options in Europe left over when the war concludes at some point. So Belarus isn't going to get involved. Russia itself probably will not launch an invasion from Belarus. From what I was reading, it's more likely that they're sending troops to Belarus for training. From what I've read, again, these are just analysts I follow on social media and whatnot that I mostly heard this from. But their argumentation is that the Russian army has taken heavy losses in Ukraine to the point where they don't really have enough experienced personnel left for training. You know, you can get just anybody to train new soldiers, but it's best if you can get people with experience to do it, because they know how best to prepare people for the real thing, you know, for actual combat. But Russia has a shortage of those kinds of people, and the ones they have are generally getting focused onto the front line because they already have a shortage of experienced personnel as is, and they need kind of all the experienced personnel they can get fighting. But that's resulted in, again, a shortage of trainers, and the theory goes Belarus has those trainers, or at least has some to spare, so to speak. And Russia is availing themselves of those services at this point in order to try to improve the quality of their new trainees. And given that their new trainees are supposed to be experienced, the mobilization order was supposed to be just for people who had already spent some time in the military. There's also been widespread reports of just corruption amongst mobilization authorities, such that a lot of regular people are getting swept up. So those people in particular need good training, especially given that it's only going to be like 2 weeks or so from what I was reading. That's really not enough time for somebody who's completely green and inexperienced in warfare to just go from civilian life to professional soldier. So that's definitely a glaring need for the Russian military. And Belarus is apparently helping them with that. So that makes sense, given the casualties that the Russian army has taken. It's kind of hard to prove, given the opacity, the opaque nature, that is to say, of the Belarusian government and the Russian military and the whole war in Ukraine. But as far as explanations go, that makes a lot of sense. So the consensus at this point seems to be that the movement of military assets into Belarus is not indicative of a pending military operation sourced from that territory.
There are a bunch of Western countries that have been helping train Ukrainian forces in a similar vein.
Oh, yeah.
I've seen pictures of like them going to the UK or to the US, and they get a training program basically that they go through. Because that's something that does take a lot of personnel, and those people you could also just have in the fights as well. Because if they have the experience to teach, they probably also have the experience to fight.
Yeah, exactly. We have lots of experienced personnel from the myriad wars the United States has been involved in over the past 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And whatever the merits or demerits, so to speak, of those conflicts may have been, it has given us the benefit of relatively experienced soldiers, especially non-commissioned officers. So they're, as I understand it, sharing their experience with their Ukrainian counterparts. And that's no doubt to their benefit. And training is a very, very important part of establishing a good, effective military. I think the old saying goes that the more you sweat on the training field, the less you bleed on the battlefield.
Oh,
Something to that effect. So good training, giving people live fire exercises, war games, and the benefit of experienced personnel sharing that experience and professional expertise. All of that is very important. It's one of the reasons the United States has historically spent so much money on training. We've got all these advanced simulators and a lot of money spent on, say, fuel and compensating farmers for crops. When you have actual live exercises in which you get in vehicles and run around and do maneuvers, it's kind of impossible to do that without trampling on somebody's territory. Sometimes you can do it on land that belongs to like a military base or government land or something, but sometimes you can't. And during the Cold War in particular, it was expected that World War III, in so much as it would have been a conventional war, would have been fought in Western Germany. And so it made sense then to have exercises there. But it's a pretty, well, relatively densely populated country. So when they had exercises, they invariably ran down any number of, crops and fences and stuff like that. And so they had a fund put aside specifically to compensate farmers for damages done to their crops and whatnot. It seems to have been an acceptable compromise on the part of the locals and the military and the German government. But that just illustrates how important it is to be on the ground and actually doing things. It's not enough just to train in a classroom. You need real hands-on experience. Yeah, I remember reading. I was recommending that book by David Hackworth, a couple weeks ago, and I was reading some segments off and on. And one of the things he talked about when he was, I think, a battalion commander or some such in the 1960s was that a lot of they trained very hard. That was the critical thing for him. But what he noticed just before he got involved in the Vietnam War is that in the years between Korea and Vietnam, a lot of units in the U.S. Army had really been skimping on real hard training, with the result that a lot of the units and the unit officers and non-commissioned officers didn't really know what they were doing. So the particular example he cited in the book, that I remember anyway, was a war game in which this one battalion was tasked with taking a position on top of a tall hill, basically. And so he was observing, trying to kind of rate the commanders and whatnot and grade them. And to his shock, because he'd fought in Korea, so he knew what he was doing. He was very experienced by that point. To his shock, the soldiers and the officers, just everybody in the battalion, just bum rushed to the hill, like just human wave attacked the hill. Like there was no nuance, no usage of cover. Like they didn't try flanking, they didn't try to bring in like airstrikes and artillery. They just rushed it. And in his mind, he knew that if they did that during an actual battle, they would have just been mowed down and taken extremely heavy casualties. But the battalion was totally gung ho, and they thought after the fact that they'd done a good job. So that was an excellent example from his perspective of how important not just training, but quality training is. If you have bad training, that's almost worse than no training, because as the example he illustrated shows, if you train the wrong way, you're actually teaching people how to get themselves killed, which is not necessarily something that happens if you get no training. You'll do stupid shit if you get no training, but bad training could be absolutely catastrophic if done really badly, as was the case here. Anyway, that's all a tangent about the importance of training.
Training is really important. You don't have to explain that to gamers. Like, people know that upgraded units are way better than unupgraded units. For infantry, you have the Marine in StarCraft, and the base Marine, like, you could cheese with that. Maybe if you want to think about like a base Marine, they're kind of like a city thug who's like in a gang, and they'll go beat somebody up when they're drunk at a bar, but they're not actually like combat, like high level and really good and accurate, and they don't do too much damage if you throw them into active war. But if you have like a 3/3 upgraded, they've seen multiple fights, they have combat shields and stims, so they're really well equipped. They have a medivac over them providing healing support. They have other troops around them, and they know how to like position themselves. Like, that's a really dangerous unit. So yeah, upgrades are really important. And then another thing is there's a lot of value in conserving your units, because it takes a long time to like get a new unit. If you're thinking about an infantry person, they have to be whatever the age to be in the military is, 18 or 21 or whatever. So it takes a long time to just grow into an adult. And then you also need to find people who are willing and able to go into combat, and then also who have the morale and focus to like fight whenever they're in a position of imminent danger, which is like a really difficult mental battle. So yeah, upgrades are super important. Training is really important. Experience is really important. And also, like you're saying with the bad habits, it made me think of the scene in Batman Begins where he's like training with Ra's al Ghul with swords, and they're just practicing and stuff, and he almost gets him, and he's kind of bragging about how I got you, and he's like, you haven't beaten me, you sacrificed your footing for a killing stroke, and he like cracks the ice and makes him fall into it to teach him a lesson. War is like that, where war is not sportsmanlike, where you're going to hold back at the last second because you're not going to kill somebody. In war, like, people are killing other people. Like, it's all the way to the violent extent. It's not the boxing ring where the bell is going to ring and then you stop sort of a threshold. So yeah, it does take a very high level of training and a very dangerous capacity of doing work.
Yeah, you mentioned time. That's also an important variable. Officers, and especially non-commissioned officers, are absolutely critical to success for any military. Officers take years to train. You have to go to like school, get a degree, like that's a whole thing. And it takes a long time. That was one of the things that kept the United States and Iraq so long. The United States ostensibly, allegedly, wanted to get out of Iraq as soon as possible. And honestly, I think that was probably the objective. I don't think they were lying about that. But one of the problems they had is that they completely just scuppered the Iraqi military and police force and had to build it from scratch. And they were hoping they could do that relatively quickly, but in order to do that, they had to train a new cohort of officers, and that took years. And ultimately, there was no quick way to do that. Mm-hmm. So it took something like 2 to 4 years, basically, to produce the first new officers. And it took a couple more years after that in order to produce a critical mass that they could use. So that's just an inherently long-term process. Mm-hmm. Weimar Germany, to kind of jump historical periods, another example. Weimar Germany was bound by restrictions placed on it by the Versailles Treaty. to keep their military within a certain size, to keep it small, relatively speaking. But they knew that eventually, or at least they believed anyway, that eventually there would be another war, and so they wanted to try to keep their military as large as they could, but secretly. So they had these little militias and whatnot, and they had these special units, and basically a lot of bureaucratic bullshit that they did as an excuse to maintain a relatively large officer corps. And it was specifically the officers that they were looking to try to preserve. Because with just regular infantry, you can mobilize them and train them over the course of like a month, and then you can have a large standing army. But you can't do the same with officers. Like, you just have to train them and build them up over time. And if you lose them and then have to build them up from scratch, there's no quick way to do that. So that's why it was so important for Weimar Germany to keep them around secretly, and why they invested so much in doing that. Pretty effective overall. By the time World War II started, they had a ready corps of officers ready to go. And all they really needed to do was to spend money building equipment, accumulating stores of fuel, and then mobilizing the regular infantry. But that's officers. Non-commissioned officers are arguably even more important. Certainly, most of the people I've talked to with military experience have high praise for non-commissioned officers. Like, they're the ones who actually do the stuff that the officers ask for. Like, officers give the orders, they strategize and whatnot, but when they give the orders, they're almost invariably giving them to some kind of non-commissioned officer, and it's their job to actually put that order into practice. And generally, they're the ones who actually know how to do that. Frequently officers actually struggle, especially early in their careers, as far as knowing how stuff actually gets done, and really depend a lot on their non-commissioned officers to teach them, basically, over time. To go back to David Hackworth's book, which, again, very good read, he mentioned that the new officers being pumped out by West Point in the 1960s were such that he did not really have a whole lot of confidence in them. From his perspective, mind you, David Hackworth was a guy who joined the military when he was like 14. And he was in it from very early, and he fought, he was part of the occupation forces in Italy after the war ended, just after the war ended. Then he fought in Korea, and then he was in Vietnam. So he was like a career guy who came in from a very young age, and also worked his way up from regular soldier into non-commissioned officer, and then actually made the jump to officer. So that's relatively rare, as I understand it. So he was a pretty top-notch quality guy. So from his perspective, and given his experience, that means something. He did not have a particularly high opinion of West Point graduates, because he thought they had too much book learning and not enough tangible experience. He thought that they had potential. He didn't think they were stupid. He just didn't entirely trust them with his units that were under his command. So what he would tell them, and again, this is going by what he wrote in his book, the way he tells it, he would tell these new officers that would come in when they would take command of like a battalion or a company or whatever, that for the first couple months, they were not to contradict their non-commissioned officer, specifically the lead one under their command, and that the NCO, generally a specific NCO designated by Hackworth himself, he was always on like really good terms with most of his NCOs. So he would say, this NCO is the guy you need to listen to, and for the first couple months, he's going to teach you how to command. And then after that, when he's comfortable taking orders from you, then you can be in command. It sounds weird, but that just kind of illustrates the importance of these guys. Non-commissioned officers are generally not fully fledged officers. Rather, they're generally regular soldiers. What's the word I want? I think unenlisted personnel, or enlisted personnel, actually. Basically, they're just regular guys who joined as infantry and then worked their way up via seniority into a non-commissioned rank. And so generally they're guys who have been around, like 5 to 10, somebody with military experience would know this better than me, but I think it's like 5 to 10 years of experience. So they've been around a long time, they've seen how things are done, and that's just invaluable in any military. And, Russia, for example, basically has no NCOs to speak of. They don't have a lot of experience in general, but even among those who do, very few of them move up the ranks into NCO.
Why not?
The Russian, The Russian military has not really prioritized building a cohort of NCOs in their army. I don't think really ever. From what I was reading, certainly the Russian army, after the end of the Cold War, has basically just seen their NCO corps shrink over time to the point where it's basically negligible. So the Russian army, as a result, has a severe shortage of experience at the front line. Like, the point of the spear of an army is like the infantrymen, right? Mm-hmm. And if you don't have experienced personnel there, then you're kind of screwed. Like, your infantry are going to be kind of rudderless and overly dependent on orders from high command. Like, they're going to be unable to really take initiative. And when they are given orders, they're probably not going to be able to implement them very smartly. Because again, experience is part of what allows orders to be operationalized in an intelligent way. To give you another example here, I was thinking of this earlier. During World War II, there were surveys done of the infantry who were doing the actual fighting. And what they found is that a surprisingly high proportion of infantry fighting in World War II, not just in the US Army, but pretty much all of the armies, a surprisingly high proportion never fired their weapon in combat, which is quite shocking, really, when you consider that World War II is, World War II, right? You'd think there would be, intense firefights in which everybody is fighting for their life. But apparently there was a surprisingly large number of people who were not able or perhaps not willing to do so. And given that the armies involved were generally draftees, basically conscript armies, perhaps it's not that surprising. If you just take a random sample of the healthy male population of any given country, invariably not all of those people are going to be the kinds of people who want to fight as an infantryman in a war. Mm-hmm. So you're going to get mixed results. And apparently that was the case in World War II amongst the infantry. Now, that doesn't mean that nobody was fighting, but among the people who were doing the actual fighting amongst the infantry, a disproportionate share of it was being done by the NCOs, the non-commissioned officers. They were the ones who knew how to stay alive. They were the ones who knew how to assault a position. So invariably, infantry battles in World War II were battles basically between the NCOs of different countries, more so than just masses of regular Joes forced into uniform being slammed against each other. It had a lot more to do with the leadership at the ground level of those NCOs. So again, underlining the importance here of the non-commissioned officer.
Yeah, and just in my headcanon, the NCO is like the old grizzled sergeant who's been in a shitload of fights, and they're like missing half their teeth and an eye, and they've got a really messed up voice, but they've been in this shit a whole bunch of times. So whenever stuff is getting kind of scary, they're like, this is nothing compared to what I faced before. They're that kind of character. Whereas the commissioned officer is someone who is probably smarter than average. They're really motivated with their academic career and so on. They paid attention in class and stuff. So they do have the brains, but they don't have any of that grit and toughness of someone who's been close to dying multiple times and had to push through it. So when stuff actually gets scary, the non-commissioned officers are the ones who are like, this is nothing. And the commissioned officers are more like, oh shit, this is actually real now.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. That's pretty much exactly the case. I think there was actually a scene in the movie Black Hawk Down, and I know Hollywood movies are not the best reference point for military affairs and whatnot, but there was one particular scene that your statement reminded me of, and it was the one where basically the infantry in Mogadishu were being suppressed by enemy fire, and the infantry were basically just hiding behind cover and waiting for relief and didn't quite know what to do. And while they were there, a Humvee with a sergeant rolls up, and the sergeant just casually walks out in the open up to them and asks them what they're doing and tells them to move out. These guys have just been huddling under cover for all this time, and then here's the sergeant who just kind of casually strolls out to them. So, it's that kind of confidence, basically, and knowledge of the battle space and where they are relative to the enemy and whatnot that just kind of defines how the sergeant is perceived in popular culture. Mm-hmm. But to a degree also in actual warfare. Those are very much the kinds of guys that the younger people, the younger infantry, look up to and depend on. Mm-hmm. It's actually the same in the police force. Amongst police, they also have sergeants, the equivalent basically of NCOs. And frequently the younger police will look to them and depend on them to kind of learn the specifics of the job, because there's only so much you can learn in a police academy. They can teach you specifics, survival tactics, procedure and protocol, standard operating procedure, but ultimately actually doing the job on the street, actually operationalizing that stuff, nothing can really prepare you for that, because invariably you're going to meet a lot of weird edge cases, peculiar circumstances, just the kind of stuff nobody can really ever be prepared for. That's the kind of stuff that sergeants are really good for, and invariably when you encounter that kind of stuff as a younger police officer, you end up calling your sergeant, just begging for help, basically. Like, I don't know what to do. What should I do here?
At Neuro, Agent Smith said that typically NCOs don't move up to officer. Is there a reason for that?
Oh, that's a question for somebody, again, with actual military experience. I just go off of what I've read and some of the family members I've talked to who have served in the military. As I understand it, basically officer rank has a lot of prerequisites, specifically academic type stuff, which a lot of guys who are NCOs just don't have. Again, West Point and other military type academies, or the Army War College, or some equivalent, a lot of that stuff is prerequisite for moving up the ranks as an officer, and that generally requires some academic proficiency or background that NCOs don't have. Again, NCOs are basically just grunts. They're guys who signed on as enlisted personnel. I hope I'm getting that. I'm always confusing enlisted with unenlisted. It's stupid, but my brain just can't quite hack it. But basically, NCOs are guys who sign up as enlisted personnel, and then they get seniority and prove themselves in whatever way, and they're able to kind of move up the ranks. But otherwise, there's not necessarily like an academic component to that, at least none that I'm aware of. I could be wrong on that, but basically the prerequisites are much less stringent than for, say, moving up to an officer rank of some kind. And again, I hope somebody, a veteran or somebody serving in the military, can elaborate on that. I'm sure they would be able to do so much better than I can.
Yeah, Steve Whiskey in the chat is saying that a lot of NCOs also just elect not to move up because maybe you're getting promoted to a rank that takes you away from the field, and that's what you wanted to do when you were signing up for the military. So
I've heard that.
Yeah.
Actually, David Hackworth talked about that in his book. Yeah, he himself just wanted to command men, basically, in combat. That was what he felt his calling was. It's what he felt he was good at. And it's certainly what he liked doing. It was his profession, he felt. But he also didn't think that he could necessarily stay in the military unless he was promoted and moved up. That was sort of part of the politics, basically, of being in the military at the time. Probably to a degree still now.
Because he was getting older?
Yeah, he was getting older, and there's a whole system of ranking and rating soldiers that can pretty easily exclude you from promotion and result in you being effectively pushed out of the military if you don't kind of continually move up the ranks. Mm-hmm. And also, Hackworth was kind of a special case too, because the U.S. military, specifically the U.S. Army, in the 1950s and 60s was kind of a weird hybrid army. Because it was after World War II that they really started to reform the Army into a professional standing army. Because, I've kind of harped on this before, but before World War II, the United States never had a large standing army. The army was always kept small, and it was only grown during times of war, specifically to deal with a particular crisis. And then after the crisis had passed, they would shrink the army back down to pre-war size. And that was just a part of American political culture. It was just a norm. It was, well, not even a norm. It was just known that having a large standing army was historically dangerous, especially for democracies. There are lots of examples in the Roman period. The Roman example kind of highlighted that. And so the United States and its political elites in the 1700s and 1800s went out of their way to make sure that the army was never large enough to threaten, or to even potentially threaten, the integrity of the political system. But after World War II, that changed. And so then it became much more professional. Basically, they got people with business majors and other academic backgrounds, and they tried to rationalize the organization of the army and professionalize it. And it really changed the whole culture of the army, really. That was actually one of the most interesting things about David Hackworth's book. Him sort of describing the new army versus the old army. So the new army is as I've described, but the old army before, the one that sort of defined the army before World War II, was much more informal. It was much more dependent on networks and who you knew, and it was not great in a sense because it kind of probably resulted in people who were qualified being excluded because they didn't know the right people. But the rationalized, professionalized army was not really that much better in most ways. And overall, it resulted in a lot of people gaming the system who previously could not really game the system because there wasn't much of a system to game. So, if you ended up with some good generals, good leadership, they would invariably network with other good people. And and that would result in enough networks of really high level leaders that in wartime you could pretty much cull the slackers and free riders and just tap those networks for leadership. But with the professionalized army, that's harder. Because again, it's a matter of, what they called in Hackworth's book, ticket punching. If you just get the right prerequisites and you get them in the right order, and if you know the right people, then you can be pretty assured of a promotion. But it's not necessarily as important as it was in the old army to actually have warfighting experience and to be good at your job. One of the themes, you might say, in Hackworth's account, basically his, what do you call it? Not memorandum. His book about his life, his biography, let's say, is that some of the best soldiers are also some of the most troublesome. In the old army, so long as you were good at soldiering, so long as you were a good leader and could deliver results, command would be more willing to overlook, shall we say, indiscretions, of which there were quite a few. Going by his book, there was a lot of indiscretions. In the new army, things were a lot more buttoned down. The command was a lot less willing to tolerate indiscretions. And the result was a more clean army, you might say, a more disciplined army, but not necessarily one that was actually better at its core mission. So the common theme throughout his book basically is this continuous conflict between sort of the rough and rowdy old army guys who were kind of buddy-buddy and ill-disciplined but very proficient, and then butting heads with sort of the new army guys who were frequently very well connected, very well educated, well networked, but who were not very competent at actual warfighting.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things about getting people who are good fighters is some people who are just they're just violent people. You put them in a war situation and they're happy, they're thriving. They've wanted to fuck shit up their whole life and now they actually get an opportunity to do so. Are those the kind of people you want as your grocers and your mail person? No, definitely not. Oftentimes they run into problems with crime, but you put them in a war setting. I think the movie Deer Hunter actually pointed to that a little bit, like the guy who ends up being one of the most successful fighters and survives was like a really good deer hunter, and the war scars him majorly, like being there. But yeah, certain people are more kind of inclined to have the skills you would need for that. Those skills are at odds with some things in life for sure, like peaceful living.
Yeah. I know we've got a number of people listening from outside the United States, so for those of you who are not Americans listening, The Deer Hunter is a movie about the Vietnam War, but it's not really focused on the war itself. It's focused much more on regular people and how they were impacted by the war. So it takes place partly before the war, during the war, and then after the involvement of the main characters in the war. And it's considered one of the best Vietnam movies. So if you're ever curious, for those of you who are curious about the American history and American involvement in Vietnam, a really good movie to watch about it would be The Deer Hunter. That's a strong recommend.
Yeah, I actually just found out about that movie because I was going through, this was quite a few years back, but the IMDb top 100 movies, and that was one of the ones that's really high up there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, The Deer Hunter, Apocalypse Now is also considered a really good Vietnam movie, although that's kind of dramatized in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who don't know, Apocalypse Now is actually a kind of revamped, revised, modernized version of a book called Heart of Darkness. I think it was called Heart of Darkness anyway. It was written by a guy named Conrad, and the book was actually about the ivory trade in the Congo in the early 20th century, which obviously is very different than the Vietnam War. But the messages in the book the message in the book overlaps with some of the drama of the Vietnam War, and so Apocalypse Now kind of adapted it pretty effectively. But certainly the imagery and the story are not necessarily defined by the actual events of the war. It's more basically just the book adapted into Vietnam. Still a very good movie. I recommend. As far as movies about the actual combat, the actual experience of fighting in Vietnam, Full Metal Jacket, I think, is generally recommended, although that's kind of dramatized too. Probably a better choice would be Platoon, which I think is probably one of, if not the highest rated Vietnam movie among the cohort. Pretty much all of these movies I've just listed were made in the 70s and early 80s. There was just kind of a period where they were making a lot of Vietnam movies because the war had just ended. It was very much a part of the American zeitgeist at the time. So Platoon, strong recommend for the war itself. Full Metal Jacket for a somewhat more dramatized version. Apocalypse Now, just for a very high quality movie in general, broadly speaking, with a message about Vietnam without necessarily a lot of content that accurately portrays it. And then The Deer Hunter, as Neuro mentioned, that's an excellent movie that focuses more on the individuals as they were impacted by Vietnam. But yeah, Hackworth was definitely one of those kinds of people who kind of had a rough upbringing and then kind of found a home in an army setting. Mm-hmm. And the early decades of the Cold War definitely kept him busy.
What did he do then?
Let's see. So Trieste and occupied Italy, which was an early flashpoint in the Cold War, the Korean War. He was deployed to Berlin during the crisis following the construction of the Berlin Wall. He was deployed to the Dominican Republic as part of an operation to try to stabilize that country. He was deployed to Lebanon as part of an operation to help stabilize that country. I think both of those were in the 1950s. And then, of course, he was an early member of the team of advisors sent to Vietnam. Well, not early. I guess we were involved as early as the 50s, but he got involved in the mid-60s, I want to say. So he was part of the advisory team that went to Vietnam in the mid-60s, and then later on he was given command of, what was it? I want to say he was given command of a battalion or maybe a brigade in the 101st Airborne Division. And so he fought, well, he was a prominent figure, shall we say, in some of those early battles there in American involvement in Vietnam. And later on, he actually got drummed out of the service because he became increasingly critical of American strategy in Vietnam. He was not necessarily anti-war per se, but he was increasingly convinced that the way America was fighting the war was not going to result in victory. And it was eventually it was that criticism of the war effort that got him in trouble. And he became later on, after he left the service, an advocate for veterans, I believe. There was also some crime involved as well, but who doesn't commit a little crime here and there?
Just a bit of crime on the side.
Yeah, I think he was accused of setting up a brothel in Saigon, supposedly for his men, but also for others, and to his personal financial benefit. So that's definitely something of a gray market activity, which is probably not legal for American personnel to engage in. He always had kind of a weird relationship in that regard with both his men and with his responsibilities as an officer. You know, one of the interesting, I know I keep harping on the book, but it really is a fun read. One of the interesting things he talked about in the book is that he believed that it was important for there to be some degree of fraternization between a commanding officer and his men in order to establish a rapport necessary for good teamwork. So the way he kind of described it, he said that his men always knew that they needed to respect him, but that there were times when they could engage in fraternization when it was kind of okay to be more buddy-buddy. And so kind of towing that line, which was always very ambiguous, he believed was very important to good leadership. And, the specific examples he had of fraternization were, well, they were probably not terms of service, to use your parlance. Shady dealings, to put it mildly. But it's the kind of thing that soldiers are known to engage in pretty much throughout history. And that being the case, probably not unexpected that it's the kind of thing he and his men were engaged in. Quite a few run-ins with military police as a result, but again, that's just all part of the game of building a rapport.
Chat mentioned Good Morning Vietnam. It's another movie.
Yeah, that's not really... I mean, yeah, that's a Vietnam movie, but that was more about one guy. And they kind of dramatized that, even more so than the other ones. Like, if you watch the movie, then you get the impression that the main character is increasingly skeptical about the war effort and is kind of turning on it. But in real life, the movie is based on real events. There actually was a radio personality who became very well known amongst personnel in Vietnam. But in real life, that figure was actually very pro-war. He was definitely very charismatic and personable, but he never turned on the war like the character in the movie did. So that was a little bit of a misrepresentation there. So that's more of a goofy movie than anything. Not necessarily because it's inaccurate, but just like the whole tone of the movie is just kind of more goofy. Until it gets near the end anyway. But the ending is dramatized. I mean, it's the kind of stuff that happened during the war, but, if you want to see the drama of the Vietnam War, definitely watch some of those other movies we listed first, because they do a much better job of portraying it and respecting events as they occurred. So we were talking about Ukraine.
Yep. And then we talked about NCOs, and that led us to Hackworth. And then we got into what he did, where he was involved in stuff in the Cold War leading into Vietnam. And then we talked about movies. We're good at tangents in this segment, so anyone who's a longtime listener will not be surprised at all.
Yeah. So we were talking about Belarus probably training Russian forces in their territory.
Yes,
so
that
was the genesis. That was the genesis. So the next item on the Ukraine list here. So this has to do with the sort of overarching global economic impact of the war in Ukraine. So one of the things that's happened is that Russia has cut off Europe from Russian natural gas exports. And that's resulted in Europe having to try to scramble to find new sources of natural gas. And predominantly, they've been leaning very hard on liquid natural gas, which has to be imported largely by ship. Well, only by ship. If it was by pipeline, it would be gas. Now, that's put a pretty severe strain on liquid natural gas markets globally. Those markets were growing, but were not anywhere near prepared for a massive jump in demand from Europe. And the result has been that some traditional buyers of liquid natural gas have been crowded out of the market. So East Asia has been a prominent consumer of liquid natural gas. They're okay. Most of those countries are actually pretty well off economically, so they've been able to afford the higher prices. But countries in the developing world in places like Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, and specifically the example I have here is Pakistan. They've been getting squeezed. And apparently Pakistan in particular has been suffering from rolling blackouts for several months now because they have not been able to secure liquid natural gas for their gas plants. And so that's been exacerbating economic difficulties, which have already been ongoing for some time. They've been slammed by inflation, the rising value of the dollar, an outflow of capital, as well as just general economic mismanagement. There's always been a pretty decent amount of corruption in Pakistan, and that's hobbled the economy, to say nothing of the military's expansive hold over some of the commanding heights of the economy. That's generally not a good thing either. So they've been hurting pretty badly, and the liquid natural gas squeeze has kind of been extra drama that they really don't need right now, to put it mildly. So that's something to keep in mind. The developing world has been getting squeezed much more so than the developed world. With all of the inflation and the wars and the political discord and whatnot, we've kind of had our hands full, so to speak, in places like Europe and the United States and whatnot. But it's easy then to forget that the developing world is actually impacted much more dramatically than we are by global inflation, by energy insecurity, by food insecurity, and also some of the changes in the climate. There's been some dramatic weather events happening in different parts of the world recently. So all of that has been causing a little bit of mayhem in certain parts of the developing world, and they're not particularly well disposed to handle it, given the lack of resources they have to work with. So just something to keep in mind as the Ukraine drama rolls on. The dramatic increase in demand for liquid natural gas in Europe has not been without consequence for the rest of the world. Let's see. Did you hear about the Ukrainian military launching some drone strikes in Sevastopol recently?
No, someone in chat mentioned some video of some kind of water drone that they were using against naval stuff.
Yeah, the Ukrainian, I guess the Navy? I guess it would have been the Ukrainian Navy had some naval drones that they deployed and used to launch an attack on some of the Russian ships in and around Sevastopol. I think they hit at least, from what I read, they hit a cruiser called Makarov, I believe. Maybe some other targets as well, but that was the one I remember. The Russians did not take it very well, unsurprisingly. They launched another bevy of airstrikes on energy infrastructure in Ukraine in retaliation, and they've also canceled the grain agreement that they had agreed to with Ukraine. That was something that was agreed, I think, in the second month, maybe the third month of the war. I don't quite remember exactly when. But basically, Ukraine, being a major grain exporter, was very upset when the Russians effectively blockaded their coast and prevented them from exporting their grain harvest for the summer. And the Russians, for their part, were able to export it. In fact, they were partly accused of exporting stolen grain from Ukraine. But eventually, they either gave in to pressure or made a goodwill gesture, depending on who you talk to, and agreed to allow Ukraine to export its grain through the Black Sea. Now, there were some bumps along the road. That agreement was briefly suspended after some Ukrainian strikes in Crimea, but eventually it went through anyway, and so the grain shipments resumed. But now it looks like they've been canceled again. So for how long, who's to say? If it's a prolonged suspension of the agreement, then that could have repercussions for the international market for grain, which is already a little bit strained, so it's not entirely clear what effect that would have. Some people were talking earlier this year that there would be dire food shortages and food insecurity, up to and including myself. From what I was reading, I kind of got that impression. But that hasn't really come to pass. So I'm a little skeptical now that there's going to be a dramatic outcome here. But it remains to be seen. That it's something to keep an eye on. If nothing else, it'll cause prices to go up and contribute to further inflation, which at this point, like I said earlier, nobody in the developing world really needs more inflation. So we'll keep an eye on that. Oh, and some new rationalizations rolled in from the Russian government as to why they're in Ukraine.
Oh, what's the reason this time?
Well, let's see. Among them, Ukraine needs to be quote-unquote de-Satanized. Had you heard about this?
I did not know about that. I had heard that they needed to be not denazified, but not de-Satanized.
Oh, no. See, denazification, that's the old hotness. The new hotness is de-Satanization.
Do you think they should also just, as a bundle deal, be like de-witchcraftimifized? as well.
Could be, could be. Who's to say? You never know where the Russian propaganda machine is going to go next. They're very creative people. They really ought to take up creative writing. No, they say that the Ukrainian government is in thrall to the globo homo Western decadent Jewish whoever conspiracy theorists identify as who's in control of the West at a given minute. Ukraine is being manipulated by puppet masters of that vein.
Right.
And so, as a result, Satanists have taken control of Ukraine, and they have to be pushed out of power in order to preserve not only the integrity of Ukrainian culture, but also Russian national security.
Yeah, hitting
apparently.
the old classic "God is on our side."
Oh, yeah. Ever popular. So that was one. They also said that they're in a quote unquote civilizational struggle against the West. That kind of ties into the desatanization. Uh, I forgot it. I forgot about this. So there was a specific detail here in the speech Putin gave talking about the civilizational struggle, and he connected it to Peppa Pig and South Park. I shit you not.
Really?
Really, he mentioned them by name in his speech. He was specifically complaining about how Western media pushes a homosexual agenda, and he cited specific episodes of Peppa Pig and South Park in which there was gay representation as examples of proselytizing, if you like, amongst the homosexual agenda setters in the Western elite.
What the hell?
Welcome to the 2020s. It's an exciting decade. Got to invade Ukraine because of Peppa Pig, Neuro.
Yeah, there's a subreddit called Not the Onion. I think it would be pretty good for that one. This actually was not posted from the Onion. The Onion, I feel like they just kind of look at the world and they're like, what do we even need to do anymore? Our job has been stolen.
Yeah, satire is dead, so they say. Well, let's see. What else did we have here? Oh, right. So that's the desatanization justification. They were also saying that Russia is under siege by the West strategically and culturally. Basically, they say that Russia, when it will win. Oh, that's right. Putin was trying to say that if Russians will support the war effort in Ukraine and if they just persevere, then they will be able to live in a world without Western dominance. He was saying that Western dominance and hegemony over the world is weakening, and that the current struggle is basically the last gasp of the West to hold on to that hegemony, and that popular support by the Russian people will allow the Russian government to win the war and thereby engineer a new multipolar world in which the Russian people will finally be free of Western interference and hegemony. It's more of a nuanced argument than the desatanization bit. It's custom designed to be popular, especially amongst developing countries where this line of thinking has much wider currency. Those were the two main ones here. They've also got some new conspiracy theories. They say that Ukraine is prepping a dirty bomb, which is to say, basically, a bomb that is not a nuclear bomb per se, but is more just a bomb that is designed to emit an immense amount of radiation. They used to call those neutron bombs back in the day, but I think now it's not quite so sophisticated a concept. Neutron bombs were supposed to be a way to kill all of the people in a city without damaging the infrastructure. But that kind of evolved into the dirty bomb, which was like a terrorist weapon designed just to do damage and cause fear, more so than to kill people. But supposedly, the Russian government is accusing Ukraine of preparing a dirty bomb attack on either Russia or perhaps Donbass. And the theory goes amongst analysts that they're trying to do that as a kind of prerequisite to justifying a potential use of tactical nuclear weapons in the Ukraine war. You know, the idea being that they would not be using nuclear weapons offensively, they would be doing it as a kind of preemptive attack against a nation they're at war with who is about to attack them with some kind of nuclear weapon. They also say that the UK is responsible for blowing up Nord Stream 1 and that British advisors were assisting in the Ukrainian military's strikes on Sevastopol, which I could actually believe. They probably are. But this is all just stuff that the Russian government and its various proxies in the media have been ranting about for the past week or two.
Yeah, if I took a drink every time I saw a headline that said Russia warns, I would be dead from alcohol poisoning. They warn us of all kinds of stuff. They warn
Yeah.
other people as well. Warnings are being issued at a rapid pace.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. They're gonna get us. Gonna nuke us. They're gonna conquer us. They're gonna subvert us. It's always something. I remember a couple years ago there was some I don't remember who it was. It must have been like Sputnik or something. Some Russian media outlet started bragging about a new Russian weapon that was designed to create artificial tsunamis, which is crazy. Like you can't do that. But I still hear people talk about it on Reddit sometimes. You know, I'll hear somebody in like a comment on a Reddit thread or something mention that, you know, we need to be concerned about those tsunami weapons. Like they could really do a lot of damage to the US coast. And I'm like, really? People bought that. People really read that and bought that.
Is that like if they just nuked the ocean next to somebody and then there would be a big
Yeah.
wave?
That's the logic.
Oh.
They say it was specifically designed to cause a tsunami by triggering a massive explosion that would trigger the kind of wave effect that would create a tsunami.
You can also nuke Mars to fix the temperature there.
Yeah. What? Sure, you could terraform Mars by nuking it. You know, that actually reminds me, there actually was a genuine nuclear engine designed in the 1950s, I think it was, that was intended to be an engine for at least intra-system travel between planets in the solar system. The idea was that you could set off a succession of nuclear explosions in order to propel a spacecraft very quickly between planets. It sounded cooler than it was practical, from what I remember, although some of the details have slipped my mind since.
I do have a correction about a dirty bomb. The technical definition of it, Fuzzy Cord says, dirty bomb is a radioactive material plus conventional explosives designed to contaminate an area with radioactive dust. What's a neutron bomb?
I would defer to Fuzzy Cord on that. Thank you.
A neutron bomb is a
Fuzzy Cord.
low-yield nuclear bomb which minimizes blast effects and maximizes neutron flux to kill organic stuff.
Oh, okay. There you go.
Today we learned.
Yeah. So I was wrong to use them interchangeably then. Thank you. What else did we have? Well, that's all I had for Ukraine for this week anyway. There's always something new happening there. Have you been following the Ukraine war video report Reddit thread? Or Reddit thing? Subreddit,
No.
that's what it's called.
I see combat footage stuff sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes that slips into the front page. But there's pretty consistent posting on that particular subreddit.
Yeah, I've been.
Some of it's just propaganda type stuff, but you know, they do have pretty legit combat footage there. You know, I think that's where that footage of the Russian pilot ejecting after getting shot down came from originally.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Oh, did you see the news from South Korea the other day?
No?
Really? Let me jog your memory. You've almost certainly heard about it somewhere. There was a big crush in a crowd in Seoul,
A crush?
like a big crowd of people that just,
Oh, stampede kind of a thing?
yeah, kind of like that. You didn't hear about it?
No? What
Oh,
happened?
wow. Okay. Well, this will be news for you then. I think the death toll is over 150 now, thereabouts. It's very high.
What the hell?
Surprising. Yeah, well, it's even weirder when you consider that it was just out in the city, basically. There was a particular district in which a whole shit ton of people went for basically a Halloween celebration, which is not really a holiday South Korea has traditionally celebrated, but apparently young people have increasingly started to celebrate it in recent years. So I've read. And apparently this one district of the city, I don't remember what it was called, basically attracted just thousands and thousands of people to the point where the streets were literally cram-packed with people. Like they were just shoulder to shoulder, to the point where people could barely move. And apparently the particular problem area was a particular side street, which was very narrow and also was at an incline, right? And what happened is that people either tripped or maybe just were pushed or whatever, but there was a group of people who fell down the incline in the crowd. And as a result, they were trampled. And nobody really even noticed outside the immediate area because it was just so loud and there were so many people. Like the crowd was just massive. You can see footage of it on Reddit. Like if you Google it, you'll see video and images and stuff. And it's easy to see how somebody could be lost under the crowd and just be trampled to death or asphyxiated. Even in some cases, it wasn't even people being trampled in that particular side street. In some cases, people were just asphyxiated because the pressure from the crowd was so strong on their body that they couldn't breathe.
Whoa.
Yeah, from what I read, the crowd was particularly large because it was the first major outdoor celebration that was allowed for Halloween since the pandemic started. Mm-hmm. So there was a lot of people that wanted to kind of come out and take the opportunity, but the resulting crowd was just way beyond the capacity of even the district city streets to handle. So the result is a surprisingly large death toll for a developed country.
Yeah, you don't normally hear about that happening.
Yeah. So that's been the dominant news in South Korea recently for the past, day or two, or thereabouts. Let's see, what is 30th? What else did I have here? Oh, there's another election coming up in Israel. Had you heard anything about that?
No.
Well, that's a result of the opposition. Well, I guess you can't call it opposition if they're in power, but the coalition government that had been in power was a very weak coalition. It was comprised of basically everybody but Netanyahu and his immediate allies. Mm-hmm. And that created some very strange alliances. Far right and far left political parties basically just came together in a last-ditch effort to get Netanyahu out of power. So it was a very unwieldy coalition, and it didn't last very long, perhaps unsurprisingly. But it's taken a while for new elections to be organized, but now they're coming up. And so we're going to see, once again, Netanyahu versus Benny Gantz, effectively, in the new election. It's not entirely clear who's going to win. Netanyahu and the Gantz-led coalition are basically neck and neck in the polls. That is to say, neither one is really pulling that much ahead of the other. So it's kind of a toss-up right now. So this is basically more of the same out of Israel. I think this will be something like the 5th election in 5 years, something like that. They've been very consistent. They would have had more, probably, if not for the pandemic. They had a kind of emergency coalition government for a while during the pandemic, but that didn't last very long. And perhaps unsurprisingly, Netanyahu was not willing to honor his end of that bargain. He was supposed to be prime minister for the first 2 years, and then Gantz would be prime minister in the second 2 years. But Netanyahu was not willing to make the transition after that. And so a new election was held. And it was that election that saw the Gantz-led coalition actually successfully negotiate a winning coalition. And they were able to govern for a while. But since then, there was enough people who left, it wasn't even very many, to cause the government coalition to lose its majority. And as a result, new elections were called again. So we'll see if Netanyahu is able to win out and get himself back into power. He's still being dogged by corruption allegations. If he can become prime minister again, then he'll be able to dodge the worst of it. It's not entirely clear what will happen if he doesn't. That remains to be seen, but he certainly has good incentive to try to win out. His tactic this time, from what I was reading, is that he's teasing the possibility of an ultra-Orthodox coalition. Basically, his main partners are these very, very conservative settler parties that are ultra-Orthodox in nature. These are basically his coalition partners. He, of course, still runs his own party, which is also very popular, retains a lot of support. But if they could win, Netanyahu could well form one of, if maybe the first, almost purely ultra-Orthodox governing coalition in the history of Israel's politics. And some of Israel's partners in the Middle East have already said that that would be very damaging for their relations. There's been a lot of improvements in relations between Israel and various Arab states in the region, specifically since the, what were they, the Accords. What were they called? The Trump administration helped negotiate them. Abraham Accords, there we go. So apparently some of those gains could be threatened because an ultra-Orthodox coalition government would probably be pretty hardline on the Palestinians, as well as various other issues in the region. And if they crack down too much in that regard, it could make it politically impossible, toxic even, for Arab governments to work with Israel, even on issues of common interest. So there's some consternation there, but it may be the only way Netanyahu can realistically build a winning coalition, so we may not have much choice. As far as Gantz, he's also got some potential to win here. From what I read, if Netanyahu is not able to get a majority in the next election, one of his partners, whom is the head of a far-right settler party, has said that he would be willing then to at least negotiate with Gantz over the potential membership of his party in Gantz's coalition, which would make it even more weird and unwieldy, but it would also give them a clear majority. And that would be good for Gantz, and that would certainly be a major defeat for Netanyahu. The settler parties have been pretty loyal, but it seems at least one of them is running out of patience. So that could be the death knell for Netanyahu if that shifts a permanent change, if that signals a permanent shift, rather, in relations between the settler parties and Netanyahu's party. But that's all in the future. That's not entirely clear yet. But that's what we're going to be watching for in the new election. Who's going to win out? What does it portend for Netanyahu? And how stable would a potential new Gantz government be? Maybe Gantz won't even be the head of it. Maybe they'll have to find somebody else. But regardless, I can't imagine it would be too much more stable than the one that they would be replacing. But certainly if Netanyahu wins, you'll see some drama in the Middle East, or at least some additional drama. The Middle East never has a shortage, but that'll be pouring a little extra fuel on the fire, so to speak.
Does the U.S. government like Netanyahu or see him as favorable to them?
That is an interesting question.
I guess it depends who in Washington.
Yeah, that's the real answer. But in general, the answer is not really. Certainly the Obama administration was on bad terms with him. The Obama administration was fairly dovish on the Middle East and was principally focused on trying to disentangle the United States from the region so that we could redistribute resources towards what you would now call the Indo-Pacific, basically towards China. But Israel didn't like that, and certainly the Netanyahu government, hawkish as it was, definitely didn't like it, So relations in that sense were relatively sour, not good. And the Trump administration came along saying that they were very pro-Israel and were willing to basically write them a blank check in exchange for support. So for the first some years of the Trump administration, relations were pretty strong. But then it became apparent that the Trump administration had limits to what it was willing to do in the region. The Iranian-supported Houthi drone attack on the oil facilities in Saudi Arabia, and then later on the United Arab Emirates. Both of those were pretty dramatic signals that the Trump administration would not really retaliate that much to significant escalations of that type. And that was very alarming for regional allies of the United States, because they had expected that the United States would go pretty hard in response to that kind of provocation. When we did not, that set off alarm bells. And it was at that point that relations between the Trump administration and Israel started to deteriorate. They never got as bad as they were between the Obama administration and Israel. But it was pretty clear in the second half of the Trump administration that the Israeli government was disappointed in the lack of interest the Trump administration was showing. Abraham Accords notwithstanding, they wanted more. and they didn't get it. So the result was skepticism and consternation in Tel Aviv, and that translated to greater efforts on the part of Israel to embrace new partnerships in the region with potential Arab state, with potential Arab partners, basically, amongst Arab states. And, that's gained some traction, but, like I mentioned, that could be in danger depending on the course that Israeli politics takes in the coming year. But yeah, in general, relations with Netanyahu have not been great. He's been a little too hawkish, even for American hawks, in a lot of cases.
When is the election you said going to be for Israel?
Get the exact date. Let me see. Is it like the next month or two? November 1st. Oh, no, that's, well, legislative elections tantamount, yeah. So I guess 2 days sooner than I was expecting. Yeah, November 1st. So we'll get feedback on that pretty soon. Well, what else did we have? Are we doing okay on time?
Yep, got about 50 minutes.
Oh, wow. Okay. And we talked about South Korea. Oh, this was kind of a goofy story, but this was from Brazil. And there was a politician who was being arrested for corruption. So the police were sent to his house to put him under arrest, take him to jail, etc. But when they got there, the politician in question did not want to be arrested. So what does he do, Neuro?
Call a gang.
Guess. Call a gang. Not bad. Pretty close. He throws grenades at the police and shoots at them.
What the hell? Okay, that's more of a do-it-yourself.
Yeah. Yeah, that's some DIY police violence. Yeah, he went hard. They ended up shooting him. I don't think he died. I think they were able to take him into custody, but there were several police injured in the process. Clearly.
Damn.
Yeah, Brazil's got some wild stories. I'm reminded of, actually, this was several years ago, but we talked about it on here on Twitch. There was a politician in northeastern Brazil, and he was upset because the police at the time were on strike, which was actually not constitutional, as I recall. So he was very much upset about that. And so, as a symbol, basically, of his opposition, he actually, I don't know if it was stole or rented a tractor or something, a bulldozer, actually. And his plan was to take the bulldozer to the local police station, where the police were picketing and also barricading the police station so that nobody could get into it. And his plan was to use the bulldozer to basically break the picket line and break into the police station.
Is this the Killdozer guy?
No, that's an American guy.
That's another Killdozer guy.
Yeah, different dude. This guy was a politician, left-wing politician, as it happens. And it turns out Brazilian police frequently carry firearms. Anybody who frequents Reddit will probably already know that. Lots of videos of off-duty Brazilian cops frequent the website. So when this politician basically threatened to run over these striking policemen, they opened fire on him. And he was actually struck in the arm and had to be taken to the hospital.
Jeez.
Yeah, I remember at the time the takeaway was that posturing can be dangerous, depending on how you do it. This was definitely a little too close to the real thing for this particular politician.
Yeah, there's another quote. Those who wield a sword should be prepared to die with one or something like that.
Oh, yeah. What is it? Live by the sword, die by the sword.
Yeah, more or less.
Let's see. Did we have any questions, or are we good on that?
I haven't checked the chat in a minute. I've just read some by glancing over.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, let's see. I did have some stuff on Iran. Not too much has changed, really. I just had basically some notes here. So I found, well, I've been reading, intermittently about the protests like everybody else. And so I started making a list of some of the things that the Iranian government was doing to try to oppose the protests. Obviously arrests and outright violence, beatings, firing on protesters, that kind of thing. But that's kind of to be expected. But they actually did have some more creative approaches to try to deal with the protests. So to just kind of blow through some of the items here, I just had three of them. One of the things they're doing is trying to deflect blame. So, for example, the families of some of the protesters who have been killed thus far have actually been told, have been pressured by the government to publicly state that their relative, their protester relative who was killed, was actually a member of the Basij militia. And the Basij militia is a pro-government militia that's been helping suppress the protests. So the idea here basically is to take what would normally be outrage about protesters killed by the authorities and turn it into pro-government outrage at the death of a pro-government figure, in this case, a Basij militiaman. So obviously, if you're the family member, that's a lie, but the idea is to get them to state it publicly so that the public will believe that it's actually the authorities who are bearing the brunt of the protests and that the protesters are violent and are targeting pro-government people of one sort or another. Mm-hmm. And of course, they're also saying that the protests are a Western conspiracy, that the people protesting are in thrall to the CIA or this, that, or the other, Western puppet master of some kind, etc. We talked before about how the Iranian government makes a habit of trying to blame outsiders for poor governance. So another thing the Iranian government does here is target funerals. They've actually been trying to pressure families to hold small funerals because frequently what happens is that people, even not related to the dead protester in question, will show up to their funeral in an effort to protest, basically, to chant anti-government slogans, to complain about the government having killed this particular protester, and potentially to use that unrest, to use that energy from the funeral to spin off into a protest, which could, start off from the funeral, from the cemetery where the funeral is taking place. So the government wants to minimize the chances of that by ensuring that the funerals for these people are kept small, to ensure there's relatively lower risk anyway of a potential unrest spiraling out of a given memorial or funeral or what have you. They also had special agents at the funerals who were telling people not to film and also telling people to delete any recordings they had on their phone of the funeral. Let's see. And there was a family of one protester who was told that one of the conditions one of the conditions they had to meet in order to get permission from the state to have a funeral is that it had to be done quietly. So this is a specific example of the authorities trying to suppress expressions of dissent at these funerals. Also, some people haven't even been allowed funerals. Some people outright have been told that, some families have been told outright that they just can't have a funeral for their family member, specifically so that people don't turn up at the funeral and turn it into a de facto protest and then potentially go protesting immediately afterwards. There was one guy in particular who was only allowed to have a funeral for his son because he himself was a veteran of the Iran-Iraq War. And in Iranian politics and culture, veterans of that war are kind of, what's the word, lionized, I guess. They're sort of heroes and looked up to. They're symbols of patriotism in the country. So this guy was given special permission, but the fact that he required special permission at all to hold a funeral for a dead family member kind of illustrates how concerned the authorities are about funerals and the extent they're willing to go to prevent them from happening as a price, basically, as a measure to suppress dissent. And the third item I had here regarded the withholding of bodies. So in some cases, they don't even turn over the body of the dead protester to the family. They just don't trust them to meet their terms, or they just don't want knowledge of the person's, well, knowledge of how the person died to go public. So this was sort of the whole genesis of the protests. The genesis of the protests regarded a woman named Mesa Amini, I think her name was. And she died while in custody, but the authorities refused to turn her body over to her family. They only let the family look at her body briefly, but they didn't allow them to have the body back. And then they just cremated her and then turned the remains over. Yeah, yeah, they went that far.
Damn.
So the idea is that the family, if they don't have the body, cannot have an independent autopsy by which the nature of the death can be independently ascertained. And of course, the suspicion from the start has been that she was beaten to death, and that an independent autopsy could have confirmed that. So we'll never know for sure now, but obviously the fact that the government went so far as to do what they did, to cremate the body before handing over
Yeah,
the
beaten to
remains.
death or worse.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. So that set people off. That led to a lot of protests, and now they're basically replicating the same approach. There are some families who are just denied access to the body of their dead loved one, and possibly that's just to prevent them holding a funeral, but it could also just be they don't want independent autopsies, because then that would basically just prove government misbehavior vis-a-vis how they're handling the protests.
Damn, that's messed up. I didn't realize it was that extreme. I can see why they're upset and protesting.
Well, I mean, the people, the regime or the authorities or the theocracy, whatever you want to call the government in Iran, it's effectively run by ideologues, specifically 70s populist Islamist ideologues. And they have the same mindset as, the kinds of conspiracy mongering populist type guys like Alex Jones or what have you that people have become familiar with over the past 10 years. So from their perspective, certainly the more ideological ones, they're fighting evil, and they genuinely believe in a lot of cases. Can you hear the gunfire in the background?
No.
No? Okay, good. Yeah, we get a little bit here in Oak Cliff. But specifically the government, from the perspective of the ideologues in the government, they really are fighting evil. That's their mindset. They really believe that Western authorities or puppet masters or what have you are sort of behind every bush, under every bed, in every closet, and that they're behind somehow the things that go wrong in their country. And that's bad. That just makes it very hard for any kind of comity to exist in Iranian politics. You can't protest against the regime when people like that are in power, because even expressing dissent in a regime like that is tantamount to subversion and treason. So they're just inherently paranoid, basically. There are reformist elements, or there used to be reformist elements within the government that were less paranoid, but those people have been slowly pushed out of power, pushed out of politics in a lot of cases even. So the result is that you have an increasingly nationalistic, paranoid, ideological state, which largely predicates its legitimacy not on good governance or a representation of the public writ large, but rather on the appeasement of the ideological proclivities of the most radical part of a particular segment of the population, that being the Islamist portion of the population. So given that context, not that surprising. There's nothing ideologues won't do to protect their revolution as they see it.
Yeah, and to clarify, the term Islamist in this case doesn't mean people who are Muslim. It means people who specifically want a kind of religion-first governance.
Yeah, in Iran's case, specifically theocratic governance.
Mm-hmm.
Although, as we've seen with religious radicals in other countries, including the Middle East, that doesn't necessarily mean they're always satisfied with the theocracy, or that they're entirely pleased with an actual theocracy, with the way they actually operationalize Islamism into government. Frequently, religious fundamentalism is really more about traditionalism than it is about actually operationalizing religious faith as a governing ideology. So in the case of Iran, it wasn't so much about putting clerics in power. It was more about countering Western influence on Iranian culture. Lots of people were upset about what they saw as West toxification, as they called it back in the 70s. And for a lot of Iranian conservatives, they believe that the only way to preserve their values and their culture was to put some kind of theocracy in power, given how closely Islamic values and culture are in Iranian culture. It's not surprising that a theocracy was the preferred mode of government for conservative traditionalists. So that's what they ended up with. But really, there's always gaps between like the actual literature of a religion and how it's practiced by like regular practitioners, just regular people. And there's almost always compromises. One of the divisions within the conservative part of Iranian politics is a divide between the theocrats, that is to say the clerisy and people who are like full-on ideological Islamists, and then the nationalists. Nationalists are invariably to some degree Islamists, but they don't take it as far as the actual clerics and their supporters do. For the nationalists, the actual details of theocracy don't really matter that much, or even really Islam for that matter. Islam for them is more a symbol of the nation rather than something that has to be rigorously adhered to for its own sake. It's a minor divide, and it's one that's kind of shrunk with time. I think the Islamists are sort of in the ascendancy right now. The nationalists less so, although the nationalists have a trump card because they're more in control of institutions like the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is an important paramilitary organization within the context of Iranian politics and the national security state in Iran. So they're still influential and powerful, but it seems the clerics and the Ayatollah in particular are kind of maybe not peaking in power, but have definitely seized a lot more over the past 10 years. Anyway, the point of that is that, yes, they're theocrats, but they're theocrats in the same way that sort of far-right ideologues in, say, Europe, or, to a less degree, even the United States, or pretty much any country are religious. It's not really about the religion as far as religious radicals go. It's more about the power, as well as the traditionalism and countering what they see as some perceived threat from maybe secular people, maybe communists, or maybe even just liberalism generally.
What about secular or Satanists, which we heard about earlier? You have to watch about those.
Well, they do call us the Great Satan over there, so there is that.
They actually call us that?
Have you never heard that before?
No.
Oh, well, I've got news for you, my friend.
Our country is called the Great Satan.
In Iranian politics, since the revolution, the Iranian government and its supporters have regularly and very publicly referred to the United States as, quote unquote, the Great Satan.
Wow. I did not know that. We have a nickname.
We do. Yeah, that's kind of their go-to. They just kind of, the funny thing is just how casually they'll use it too. They just be like, oh yeah, the Great Satan is responsible for this. And it's just immediately assumed, oh yeah, they're talking about the United States. That's just kind of the term that they like to use.
Raise your black metal emotes, chat.
There you go.
They call us the Zionist entity as well, apparently, I guess because we're an Israel ally.
Yeah, for Iranian ideologues and the Iranian government, Israel and the United States are interchangeable. Like they see us as sort of controlled by the same elite. So there's almost no difference.
Oh.
From their perspective, there's nothing Israel does that is not done with the implicit permission of the United States government and more specifically American elites. So all of the airstrikes that Israel does in Syria against Iranian targets, all of the espionage that the Mossad does within Iran as far as assassinating Iranian scientists, all of that stuff from their perspective is done by a common Israeli/American enemy, which again is basically just the same entity, the Zionist entity, as they call it.
Do they think of it as like a deep state kind of obscure a set of elites, some kind of cabal? Yeah.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But it's like a more widely held belief there, because here in the U.S. there are also people who believe in that, but it's more like conspiracy theorists. But that's like mainline their government seeing how we exist.
not everybody in their government. Again, there used to be a lot of reformists in the government who were maybe not so ideological. And there's probably a lot of ideologues that know it's bullshit too. But not only within Iran, but in the Middle East generally, there is a strong undercurrent, maybe a large minority, you might say, that does genuinely believe that. And that actually stems from the mid 20th century, roughly. We've talked before about pan Arab nationalism, right? Yeah. So that was the dominant ideology in Arab nations through the early and mid 20th century. And it's been one of the dominant ones ever since. And the formative years for that ideology, roughly speaking, were very much in the early 20th century. And that was a rough period for an ideology to kind of appear, because that was very much an era defined by the popularity of German militarism. So there was a lot of German ideas that became popular in the developing world, such as it was at the time. And the Arab world in particular latched on to a particular set of German ideas that kind of centered around the decadence of the West, but also Jewish conspiracies, specifically Zionist conspiracies. And I think those resonated in particular because of the whole Zionist issue in Palestine, which was very much an issue then, as it is now, as it had been for some decades, even by then. And the result is that there were a lot of conspiracy theories that spread prolifically through much of the Arab world. It didn't help that that was still the era of imperialism. So there were genuinely conspiracies propagated by imperial powers of one sort or another to try to expand Western influence. You saw that after World War I with the way they carved up the Ottoman Empire, and then the way that the British tried to suppress rebellions in places like Iraq and tried to deal with the whole Zionist issue, which they were kind of wishy-washy on for a long time. So, there were conspiracies propagated by imperialist powers of one sort or another. So that just lent itself to a witch's brew of ideological churn that had a somewhat negative impact, you might say, over the long term on some of the impressions that members, certain quarters, shall we say, of the Arab public have of certain groups, Jews, the West, Americans, etc. It's also contributed to a great deal of conspiracy mongering in a lot of political cultures in the region. It's very typical. It's totally typical for conspiracy theories about the West and Western intentions in the region to have widespread currency. Not all of them are inherently anti-Semitic or necessarily anti-Zionist of one kind or another. But conspiracies are just super common there. It doesn't help that corruption and limited state capacity have just destroyed, or at least undermined, public confidence in politicians, political parties, states, really authorities of any kind. And that lack of trust makes it very difficult to build a rapport amongst the governed and the governors, such that the powers that be in any given society can really govern effectively with the full support and trust of the population. It's part of the reason why there's so much conflict within the region. It's really not about groups within a country coming together and negotiating how to share power. It's really much more about different groups fighting directly with each other under the slim supervision of a very weak state. That's pretty much been the norm for a lot of the Middle East for a long time. It has become increasingly the norm over time. Some of that is the US's fault. Destroying the Iraqi state was probably not the best idea, as vile as that state may have been under Saddam Hussein's control. Syria's melted down. Lebanon has been melting down, although in that case more to economic mismanagement. Iran is not exactly doing great either, although they're doing better by comparison. But yeah, to answer your question, there is widespread belief in conspiracies about Zionist conspiracies within Iran, although I don't think a majority of the population necessarily believes them. But everybody's at least aware of them, and they do have wide currency there.
Today I learned some cool nicknames we have around the world.
Yeah, I'm surprised you haven't seen a video at some point of the rallies they have. Ever since the revolution in 1979, there have been regular rallies in, at the very least, the capital, Tehran, if not in other major cities in Iran, in which government supporters, or at least people who have been somehow incentivized or coerced to participate. Sometimes governments force government workers to come to government rallies and whatnot. But regardless of who attends, there are regular rallies in the capital in which they go on protests slash parades, chanting anti-American slogans, anti-Zionist slogans, and what have you. Frequently, "Death to America" is one of the most common, which gets a lot of play in American media because it sounds very dramatic. But actually, in point of fact, in the Farsi language, when you want to insult somebody or something or just curse generally, you say "death to" whatever it is you don't like. So "death to America" is not a way of, like, it's not some radical expression. It's basically just the way that you say "fuck America" in the Farsi language,
Right.
which is not nearly as dramatic as, "death to, America" or what have you. So something to keep in mind when you read that in headlines or in articles or whatnot. It's not as it's not as pointed a political statement as you might think. It's more of a guttural expression of dislike than anything.
Well, that makes sense. And nobody is really liked everywhere, except Costa Rica.
Well, it helps to be small, to not have an army, and to just kind of generally be relatively stable. That's a pretty good combo. I think anybody would appreciate that.
Well, and I think most countries like Canada as well.
Let me think.
Who dislikes Canada, really?
Who dislikes Canada? I guess nobody. I don't think anybody. Well, China.
Why does China dislike Canada?
Do you remember the whole Huawei
Yes.
finance officer thing?
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so she was I want to say she was the finance officer of Huawei, and she had a house or something in Vancouver. But then Huawei was accused by the United States government of sanctions busting sanctions on Iran, which they had done before and been punished for, but then they were found to have done it again. And so the United States government asked the Canadian government to, what's the word I want? Expatriate, where you take a criminal and hand them over to another country. What's the word?
Oh, yeah. I know the process. I don't know the
Totally
word.
slips my mind. Chad will come up with it. Well, you know what I mean. They asked the Canadian government to hand her over, and the Canadian government refused. Well, they didn't refuse, but they said that there had to be a process. And so there was a years-long period when the Canadian government went through the whole process of seeing whether or not they were allowed to do that. And of course, the woman in question, I think her name was like Mong something, Mong Hezhou, I don't remember. But of course, her lawyers made several appeals rather, and the result is that the whole process was prolonged over a stretch of numerous years. And the case didn't end until there was an agreement between the United States and China, in which the United States agreed to drop the request, extradite. That's what it was. The United States asked Canada to extradite her. So there was an agreement in which the United States agreed to drop the extradition request in exchange for certain Chinese commitments. I don't remember exactly what the details were. But as a result, she was allowed to walk. But in the intervening years, the Chinese government was very upset that Canada refused to just release her at Beijing's request. And the result is that relations took some damage, and the Chinese government did not miss the opportunity to complain vociferously about Canada and how it was a lapdog of the United States and how it was anti-China and, all this, that, and the other kind of anti-Canadian propaganda. So as a result, there is a little bit of bad blood between some quarters of the more nationalistic parts of the Chinese body politic and Canada. So there's that.
Well, that makes sense, though.
But other than that, yeah, your point is well taken.
Most people like Canada.
Yeah, most people are pretty pro-Canada. They're pretty well behaved. They tend to stay out of trouble.
Yeah, they don't have a huge population either, and they don't get into as much foreign adventurism as some other actors.
some other Anglo-Saxon countries we could name.
Yeah, the big Satan.
And the Great Satan and the Great Satan's father, the UK. We've had some misadventures. But Canada's been pretty clean cut in that regard. Although they did have a nasty reputation during World War One, apparently.
Why?
I don't know if you. Yeah, apparently a lot of Canadian soldiers were very, very aggressive during World War One, to the point where they had a reputation as being borderline barbarians, at least amongst the Germans. Pretty tough fighters. You have to give them that. And they did take a beach on D-Day. For those of you not familiar with World War II, D-Day was the invasion of France in 1944, as propagated by the United States, the UK, and actually Canada. You can probably, I mean, I think everybody's seen Saving Private Ryan, so everybody's probably pretty familiar with the D-Day landings. You know, the opening minutes of Saving Private Ryan kind of illustrated the landings, you know, in dramatic fashion. Although I would point out that the specific beach landing portrayed in Saving Private Ryan was Omaha Beach. There were 5 beaches that were landed on. Omaha Beach was one of the 2 U.S. landing beaches. I think the other one was Utah Beach. And Omaha Beach, out of all 5 beaches, was known to have been the toughest, specifically because the tanks and other armored vehicles that were supposed to land on the beach failed to do so. You know, basically the little schemes that they had devised, little mechanisms that were engineered to get those vehicles from the ships to the beach failed, and most of those tanks and whatnot sank into the ocean before they reached the beach. And as a result, it was basically just infantry versus fixed defensive positions, which very rarely goes particularly well for infantry. All the more so given that they were stuck on a beach of all places. So there were heavy casualties taken, which is why it was so violent in Saving Private Ryan. The other beaches went much more smoothly. They generally had a lot more tanks successfully land, and so they had much more armored support. But the point is, the US took 2 beaches, Omaha, Utah. The UK took 2 beaches. I think that was Gold and Juno. But then Canadian infantry, well, not just infantry, but Canadian forces, were actually responsible for taking the 5th beach, which I think was Swordfish. I might be mixing up the names. So give Canada credit. They full-on participated in D-Day and pulled their weight easily.
Good job, Canada.
Well done. They also contributed a lot to the Battle of the Atlantic. That's a whole other story. Anyway, I'm getting a little off topic as far as Iran. I had a couple more items there.
Speaking of Iran, Canada kicked ass on D-Day in World War II.
Yeah. Tangents within tangents. Yeah, so one of the things Iran did in the past couple weeks is they actually launched drone strikes within Iraq. And specifically, they were striking targets within Kurdish territory. And the way the Iranian government tells it, they're saying that there are elements within Kurdish territory in Iraq that are contributing to the protests that are occurring in Iran, supposedly. And they say that the strikes were meant to kind of punish and deter them from doing so. Whether or not that's true or not, anybody's guess, I have no idea. But they definitely did blow some people up in Kurdish Iraq, much to the chagrin and despair of some of the people there. It's not exactly a quiet part of the world. So it seems that the Iranian government is not above striking outside of its boundaries as part of its response to the protests. So you can add drone strikes outside of Iran, even, to the list of things that the Iranian government has been doing to try to tamp down on them. So let's see, what else did we have? As far as Iran, there was an article I read recently. I actually posted it on my Twitter account. They had an analyst, a Middle East expert, talking about some of the things that they would want to see before they were willing to concede that the protests might escalate into something more than just sporadic protests, into a potential legitimate challenge to the authority of the government that could actually unseat it. So the three specific catalysts that they're looking at, that they're looking for rather, one, if the military turns on the government. Right now, the military and even the IRGC actually have not actually been deployed against the protesters yet. Thus far, it's been police and besieged militia only. So if the military were ordered to turn on the protesters and disperse them by any means necessary, that could create tension such that the military says, no, we won't do that, or maybe even stages some kind of coup. So that would be one thing to watch for. When the military or if the military gets involved, that's going to be a major sign right there of potential escalation. Another sign, another catalyst here, division within the government. If elites within an authoritarian government start fighting with each other, that could portend a collapse of the government and a potential change in power. So that's something else this analyst is looking at. And then number 3 here, they were looking at the potential emergence of a leadership figure for the opposition amongst exiled leaders. Right now the protest movement is famously decentralized, which to a degree gives it power because it means there's no one group of people or no one person that can be arrested or coerced into shutting the movement down. But it also means that it's very difficult for the Iranian government to actually offer concessions or to negotiate some kind of compromise settlement with the protesters. So if the protest movement coalesces behind some kind of leadership, perhaps one outside of the country in exile right now, that could portend a potential resolution favorable to the protesters, or potentially an escalation of the protests into a general uprising, depending on what the leadership would want to do. Mind you, this last item here, coalescing behind a leadership, that's not unprecedented. The protests in the 1970s that led to the overthrow of the Shah of Iran were initially sort of unwieldy and kind of lacked leadership, but eventually they coalesced behind Ayatollah Khomeini. I think that's what his name was. The Ayatollah was a very well-known and revered figure within Iran, but because he was critical of the government, he had been living in exile in France for some years before the protests even started. And when the protests gained sufficient traction, he actually returned to Iran. I think against the permission of the government even, but they were too afraid to stop him. And at that point, he was able to take on a leadership role. And from there, protests were able to escalate into regime change, so to speak. So there could be a similar phenomena. I don't know that there's any potential leadership in exile right now that has nearly the same stature that the Ayatollah did in the 70s. So there's no clear candidate for that role. But hypothetically, somebody could try to fill that role, or maybe somebody's popularity rises enough in the coming months that they could gain the stature to fill that role. But regardless, this analyst is just pointing this out as a potential scenario. This is the kind of thing that they would be looking for before they would be willing to say that the protests were unusual. There's been mass protests in Iran before. There's been at least 2 major ones I can think of in the past 10-some years. And neither one of those went anywhere. And for now, it kind of looks like these current protests are going to end up end up being similar, end up being similarly ineffectual. Again, who's to say? Anything could happen. But for now, they're following the same pattern.
Are they boiling down their protests to specific demands that they want? You said that they're contesting like hijab law and stuff.
Yeah, hijab rules were the initial catalyst, and they're still asking for changes on that. But there's also people asking for the overthrow of the government, calling the Ayatollah a criminal, a butcher, saying that the government is intervening too much abroad, saying that the economy is a shambles and the government is incompetent. I mean, basically everything that's going wrong in Iranian society right now is subject to complaint by the protesters. Mm-hmm. But there is no clear-cut set of itemized demands that the government could deliver on in order to pacify them. This is more just a general expression of discontent rather than an organized effort to challenge the government's authority. And that's why this analyst in particular was somewhat skeptical about the prospects for success. So a final note on Iran here regards the nuclear talks, which are still technically ongoing. They never really stopped, but they have been deadlocked for several months now. The new Iranian government was cagey from the start. This is a new government that took power in 2021, I should say, mid-late 2021. Since that new government took power, they've been very cagey about how interested they genuinely were about a nuclear deal. That is to say, a deal regarding Iran's nuclear program, specifically a potential program to develop nuclear weapons. And at first, they kind of entertained the thought that a deal would be a good thing, and they kind of negotiated nominally in good faith. But then they started to drag out the negotiations by focusing on a couple key items of disagreement. And eventually, it became apparent that they were not really interested in finalizing the deal. And eventually, the talks just kind of deadlocked. They were still nominally talking, but the talks weren't going anywhere. They were basically just going in circles. So that's kind of put the nuclear deal negotiations on the back burner. Recent events, specifically the protests, and more specifically, Iran supplying loitering munitions to Russia. We talked before about how the Iranians were using, that is to say, the Russians were using suicide drones, the loitering munitions, to strike energy infrastructure in Ukraine. A lot of those they have bought very recently from Iran. And so that has the West upset. Obviously, we don't really appreciate Iran getting involved in a war that the West generally views as illegal and wrong and a threat to their security. A lot of analysts and governments even have pointed out also that Iran supplying these loitering munitions actually breaches sanctions. So that's resulted in a big push to sanction them more, although they're already sanctioned to the hilt, so that's not going to matter much. However, one substantive side effect is that it's resulted in the nuclear deal being further marginalized. At this point, even European governments are less interested in the nuclear deal than they are in the fact that Iran is now involved in the conflict in Ukraine. And they were already involved in any number of conflicts in the Middle East, so of course the US was already quite interested in deflecting Iranian influence in the region. So the fact that the Europeans are on board as well now kind of bodes ill well for the prospects of a final agreement vis-a-vis the nuclear deal, such as it's called. So it looks like that's dead in the water at this point. It was already looking like it was on its last legs, but recent shifts in Iranian foreign policy vis-a-vis Ukraine probably suggest that the Europeans are going to take more of an American approach to the negotiations, which is to say that they're more interested, not just interested in the specifics of restraining the Iranian nuclear deal, but also a broader range of issues that include Iranian influence in the Middle East and now also Ukraine. And given that the Iranians have cited that as one of their red lines, that being that they're not willing to expand the negotiation to involve things not related to their nuclear program, that suggests that the negotiations are just dead. Europe was able to keep them alive because they were one of the principal parties interested in restoring and renegotiating the nuclear deal. But without them, that just kind of leaves, China, India, not exactly heavy hitters diplomatically. I don't think they're going to have enough sway to really return Iran to the nuclear deal by themselves. So that suggests, one, that there's going to be much more focus on inhibiting Iranian activities in the Middle East, which could be a good thing in so much as those activities are violent. But it also means that it's much more likely that Iran is going to make a push to an actual nuclear weapon, because at this point, there's not a whole lot stopping them. Maybe oil sales to China. Maybe China would punish them if they made a blitz for a nuclear weapon, but it's debatable. I don't know. China would probably prefer cheaper oil rather than preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. It's not their neighborhood, and I don't know how much they would really care that much in the first place. But it could be that the Chinese are sufficiently concerned about proliferation that they might make an exception in this case. So in that sense, maybe there is a remaining deterrent to an Iranian nuclear weapon. But I don't know that too many people are really privy to the Communist Party of China's Iran policy. They tend to be pretty cagey about that kind of stuff. So that'll be yet another exciting 2020 item to watch for, a potential Iranian nuclear weapon. Some people in the US are pretty skeptical about it because some of the more hawkish elements in the foreign policy community here in the US have been harping about an Iranian nuclear weapon for literally decades. You know, you could find people talking about that back in the 80s, and they just kind of keep talking about it like it's a good excuse to launch airstrikes on Iran, go to war with Iran. You know, they always have some vision for the projection of American power in the region that involves constraining Iran in some way like that. And it's kind of an example of the boy who cried wolf, right? And people in the US have heard it so many times that they just kind of see it as a excuse to go to war rather than a substantive foreign policy objective. But at this point, we could be nearing a point where a hawkish Iranian government actually might try it. So it might be that the US government has to pivot, you know, pretty quickly as far as taking on a more hawkish approach to Iran in order to contain the nuclear program. That could happen out of the blue. It may not be something the Biden administration really prepares people for. You know, there may just be some new intelligence about some kind of breakthrough for the Iranians or some new information about their intentions, and the Biden administration may just decide to bomb those specific locations. You know, some of the specific locations at which the uranium is being refined, maybe some of the sites at which supposedly the nuclear program is the nuclear weapons are being assembled, and potentially also some of the manufacturing facilities at which some of the rockets and missiles that the nuclear weapon might be housed in could be manufactured. So we may just wake up one day and hear about American airstrikes in Iran, and the Biden administration may just try to justify it after the fact. Some other adventures to look forward to. But I could be overselling it too. Like, it could be just that the Biden administration is too risk averse, especially given how averse to interventions abroad that the American public has become. It could be that the Biden administration is too risk averse to do that, and they prefer to find some other way to do it, maybe just outsourcing it to Israel. I don't doubt if Israel found out Iran was going to blitz for a bomb that they would just launch airstrikes. Like, they wouldn't hold back. They would do something, probably something dramatic. The Biden administration may prefer that than direct American involvement. So we'll see. That's, again, I've been talking about the potential for a conservative Iran government pushing for a nuclear weapon since 2019 now, when I first saw escalation in the relations between Iran and the Trump administration way back in 2019. That directly led to the assassination of Omar Soleimani in early 2020 and all of the drama that resulted in. But ever since, I've kind of been watching that, but nothing has happened yet. But at the same time, there's only been more and more new factors suggesting that it's more likely. So I haven't backed off of the prediction yet. I would want to see some kind of change away from hawkish foreign policy in Iran before I would concede that the Iranian government doesn't want to do it. So it's still on my radar for the moment. How are we doing?
10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay. Let me see here. I think I did have another interesting item. Yeah, this was an article. This had to do with an article I read about the so-called Franco-German engine of European politics. Have you heard of this?
Franco-German engine?
Yeah, so the cornerstone of the European Union was from the start, and to a degree remains today, the relationship between Germany and France. Obviously, they're historical rivals, and some of their wars are pretty famous. You know, the World Wars in particular resulted in a great deal of destruction. So there was a great deal of mistrust and skepticism in both countries of the other party, especially in the aftermath of World War II. So the creation of a common European polity, you know, a kind of European government in which both those countries would share power and cooperate with each other rather than, you know, try to kill each other, was considered a major important objective for the future peace and prosperity of Europe in the aftermath of World War II. And they were successfully able to do that, although it took a while. They were very ambitious after World War II, but they were not able to create the common European defense community that they wanted to create. Instead, they just leaned on NATO for security. They also wanted to create a kind of pan-European government. That also failed, but they were able to sort of plant the seeds of what would become the European Union by creating in the 1950s an institution called the European Coal and Steel Community. And as the name implies, that was basically a free trade zone between member states, specifically for coal and steel, which sounds weird, perhaps, and maybe a little boring, but understand that in the mid 20th century, coal and steel were some of the most important, if not the most important, items and commodities in a modern economy. So to have free trade between them was a big deal. So from the European coal and steel community and the cooperation that it represented, symbolized, and inculcated, new institutions were created that further created new pan-European institutions and further integrated different European countries together. And eventually, those institutions were coalesced together in I want to say, the early 1990s into a new institution called the European Union, which of course everybody is pretty familiar with by now. It was not an entirely new institution. Basically, they just took pre-existing institutions and renamed it. But they also added some new features over time with successive new constitutions that were voted on. Well, not constitutions, I should say treaties, like the Lisbon Treaty, the Maastricht Treaty, etc. So each of those treaties introduced new bureaucracies, new forms of representative government, and just new elements in general to try to make it look more like an actual pan-European government. Some people have become very critical of that effort since then, but it was considered for several decades, up until maybe the past 10 years or so, as an absolutely critical objective, for European politics and the stability thereof. So again, all of that came out of a desire not just to create a European community, but also to try to reconcile Germany and France with each other. Those were the two main powers in the West, and they were the ones whose wars had been, particularly damaging. Not to place all of the blame on just them, but certainly their rivalry was a major driver for conflict in the early 20th century. So reconciliation between those particular two countries was seen as particularly important. Hence the European Coal and Steel Commission, the European Atomic Commission, or Community rather, the European Coal and Steel Community, the European Atomic Community, and some of the other institutions that were created, the single market among them. I can't remember which institution that was, but all of those were sort of predicated on cooperation between France and Germany because they were the largest and most important nations within those communities, easily. Because the UK didn't even join the European single market until like 1975, 76, something like that. So easily France and Germany were the most important countries there. And Germany, I would point out, was still just West Germany at that time. So truncated compared to now, although still very powerful, economically speaking. Much more so than, say, Italy or Portugal, or basically any of the Low Countries, that is to say, Belgium, the Netherlands, or Luxembourg. Scandinavia, the Scandinavian states were not members of the single market at that time. They preferred bilateral agreements with the United Kingdom. And Spain was still run by the quasi-fascist military leader Franco, whom was not very popular, after World War II for obvious reasons. So he was largely excluded from this whole process until he until he died, and the new government democratized. So really, France and Germany pretty much were the Western community for several decades as a result. And even after those communities expanded, and after the European Union was created and expanded, France and Germany were still the largest economies and were some of the most influential. And cooperation between them was continued to be seen as absolutely critical. So this is all just background information for stuff that Europeans have known forever. Yeah, that's all just the norm for them. But what's relevant more recently is that there's actually been some discord between France and Germany. Both of them are still, as far as, say, Ukraine, still very pro-Ukraine and still want to support them. The issue has more to do with things like the Eurozone and more recently with energy. So the Eurozone saw discord because France was one of the countries that had a lot of outstanding debt and looked like it would need some kind of relief, whereas Germany obviously had much better finances, had a surplus in exports, and was just generally more economically healthy. So that led to disputes about how to respond to the Eurozone crisis. Germany wanted countries that had borrowed too much money and spent too much to just cut spending and implement structural reforms. France, in contrast, wanted to create something that was called Eurobonds, which were bonds that were issued by the European Union and were backed by all of the member states collectively, specifically including Germany, which had a much higher credit rating than the other member states. And the idea was that those euro bonds could be used to help bail out countries like France or Italy or Greece or what have you, and help relieve them of the debt burden that they were suffering from, and that was forcing them into a lot of difficult decisions as far as government spending and austerity. So obviously, Germany was not in the least bit interested, in bailing out countries that it perceived as having been fiscally irresponsible. But that then led to accusations by countries like France that Germany was not sufficiently pulling its weight and was not, as shall we say, burden sharing, was not being a good member of the European community by helping deal with communal issues, which of course sounded to Germany like a cop-out and an excuse to just get them to pay for their mistakes. You can see how this debate escalated. This is like roommates arguing over who owes what money for what bill and whatnot. So that argument was never really resolved, but eventually the Eurozone crisis abated sufficiently that it did not become a non-issue per se, but faded into the background and was superseded by other new issues, of which, of course, Europe has had quite a few over the past 10 years. Now, that brings me then to the energy crisis, which we're experiencing now. And that, of course, is something that's been partly ongoing, owing to inflation that has increased the price of natural gas and oil. We kind of saw some of that in 2021, as well as the corresponding pressure on governments to try to subsidize prices. But with the war in Ukraine, we've seen we've seen Russian natural gas curtailed at first to Europe, but then eventually cut outright. And that's put Europe in a very awkward position. So, how do countries respond to this common energy crisis? This is clearly an issue that affects all of Europe. So, presumably, then there should be a common European response to it. But just like with the Eurozone crisis, there's different ideas as to what that should be. For Germany, they're spending a lot of money themselves on their own industry to help prop it up, which is itself controversial. We talked about that last week. But then they're also advocating for integrating the energy infrastructure of Europe together better. Right now there's different parts of Europe that are more or less integrated into each other's energy infrastructure, with the result that it's relatively difficult for surpluses in one area to be extended to another area, or for stored resources to be sent to areas where there's a scarcity. Now, one of the flashpoint issues in this regard is a pipeline called the Mid-Cat pipeline, which is a pipeline that would link Germany to Iberian energy networks, that is to say, energy networks in Spain and Portugal. Now, for this to work, the pipeline, has to be approved by France, because the pipeline, obviously France is between Germany and the Iberian Peninsula, and France has actually refused to permit the construction of this pipeline through its territory. They have opposed the construction here, and the reason they're doing that is because that they actually benefit from higher energy prices in Germany. They would prefer to be Germany's principal point of sale. Not point of sale, but they would prefer to be Germany's principal seller of liquid natural gas. And if they connect Germany to Spain and Portugal, they probably won't be able to do that. Spain and Portugal have actually a surprisingly high number of liquid natural gas terminals. So invariably, they would be a major supplier if Germany could be directly connected. So France apparently under the Macron government, prefers not to allow that, apparently, from what I was reading. And, correct me if I'm wrong on that. Maybe there's some countervailing opinion here amongst listeners. But the way I read it described is that it seems France is prioritizing its own revenue here over building this pipeline, which would actually contribute towards an easing of the energy crisis in Central Europe, not just Germany. And you can see how that itself would be very, very controversial. That is not exactly something you would expect of a country performing its communal European duty, so to speak. But again, this is just one example. There's also been countries in places like Hungary that have refused to participate in sanctions against Russia. Some countries have kind of been slow-footing material aid to Ukraine. There's some practical considerations there, but in general, even given the lack of Soviet equipment, you would expect more from countries like, say, Germany or what have you.
Yeah, it's interesting these larger scale organizations like the EU and like NATO that have rules for its members, but it's sort of like rules of a homeowners association where you can kind of step on the line of the rule and step over it a little bit, and all people can really do is get mad at you, but they can't really fix it directly that easily. So it's like a way to apply pressure and to guilt member states into following a certain line, but there are ways of working around that. You were talking about the restrictions of German military after the World War and stuff, and how there are so many ways of talking about that. Like, you were training people combat maneuvers. No, we weren't. It was a strange dance style. You just sold a whole bunch of explosives to them. Those aren't explosives. That's mining equipment. Oh, okay.
Yeah, the homeowners association analogy is surprisingly and hilariously accurate. I've never heard that before, but that is actually a perfect description.
I just made it up because I'm thinking
politics.
Of when my parents were in it and stuff, and people are arguing about whose grass is too high and stuff like that. And a lot of the arguments just don't really amount to anything that matters that much at all, but it's kind of about the aesthetic of the group and what their opinions on things are. But each individual in the association has a very different opinion about what your home should look like if you add up all the different factors. But yeah,
that's kind of what it comes down to. But the point I'm driving at here is, even by the standards of often contentious politics and, tension between European states within the European Union, the past 10 years of discord between France and Germany in particular have been unusual and a little disconcerting. Like, normally, historically, both countries have gone out of their way to cooperate and ensure that even if there were differences, they were not generally substantively public. They were not substantively manifest publicly. But over the past 10 years, some of the differences have become sufficiently large that those differences have manifested publicly. And it's brought into question the ability of Germany and France to really lead the European Union in a cohesive way, in a way that is able to actually corral all the different member states and create and present a common front to the world. The harder and more contentious these debates become, the more it seems that Europe is fracturing more and more into separate states pursuing separate policies. So that's not great. Again, the European project, as it's called, the project of creating an integrated, unified Europe, is valuable, is important. It's definitely justified by the history of Europe. So, it's understandable why the political elites in Europe, treat it with such reverence and as such a priority. But in so much as that project is starting to fracture a little bit, much more so, I would argue now, over the past couple of years than, say, during the Eurozone crisis, when it was still more technical, I would argue, and more narrowly focused. That could portend some very negative trends in Europe, depending on how long the crisis lasts and how European leaders respond to it. So that's another thing to watch here. The cracks could widen and could get worse and could turn into something really dangerous. Or this could just be a temporary blip in which difficult issues are hashed out and eventually a compromise is reached later on that results in a stronger, more unified Europe, which would be great for everybody. yet another fun open adventure for the 2020s to keep track of.
We'll keep an eye on that. But I think we are about at time. Thank you very much, Mr. Agent Smith, and people in the chat for being pleasant and chill. We didn't get a massive raid here tonight, but the viewership always goes up during this segment, and a lot of people are asking about it before we get started. And as a reminder, 99% of the time, we haven't pre-planned and confirmed an Agent Smith until like 2 hours before. People are like, hey, Neuro, is Agent Smith going to be on tomorrow? God only knows. I haven't even asked him.
Yeah, it's a very informal arrangement, but it seems to work for us.
Heck yeah. Well, that's, I think, where we thrive more so than being super regimented, given our degen gamer lifestyles.
Yeah, unfortunately so. But you, for your part, handle it very well. I might compliment on you that. I've always been impressed with how professionally you've managed to run what is a very informal sort of framing. So, well done on that count. You've really made a successful business out of it.
Appreciate that. I try to. There are definitely ways that unprofessionalism pays on Twitch. Shooting from the hip, talking shit about other broadcasters and stuff. To me, that just looks like dollar signs, but it's like you have to compromise your principles a little bit if you're going to do that.
Well, that's just another impressive thing about your particular brand. You really carved out a really nice niche here where you focus on mindfulness and well, maybe not spirituality per se, but mindfulness and discipline and self-control. Those are very valuable features for anybody. And the fact that you've taken a Twitch stream of all things and made those your hallmarks, very impressive.
Appreciate it. One quick question for you to wrap up. Chad is asking, what is Agent Smith playing lately? I'm guessing in terms of video games.
I've been playing too much HOTS again.
Heroes of the Storm. I don't know.
Yeah, it hasn't been shut down yet.
Nice.
Yeah, I got half good at Medivh. And, those of you familiar with HOTS will know the significance of that. It's a very unusual hero to play. Yeah. And it's fun in an unusual way. I like sort of the weird play style. Mm-hmm. So I frequently come back to it just for that reason. I should be playing some strategy games or something intelligent, but there's no substitute for MOBA thrill, as cheap as it may be. So that's my degen gaming story for the day.
Nice. Agent Smith has been playing some HOTS. I've been really hyped to play Dota 2 lately. They just finished the International over the weekend. It was a pretty cool event overall. One of the main storylines that people were excited to see was Peru's team made it to top 4, I think, in the tournament. Top 4 or top 6 or something. And they're traditionally a region that most regions like EU and China and stuff, they kind of see South America as crap. So for them to kick major ass was really cool to see. Overall, the event, I think it had some technical issues and stuff, and it was kind of weird because they had all but the top 4 one weekend, and then there was a week break, and then they did the rest of it the next weekend. But the game is in a really fun spot. I've been playing it a whole bunch, and it's fun for me too because I'm pretty noob at Dota compared to StarCraft with how much time I put into it. So I feel like I get to learn a big chunk of stuff every time I play, instead of StarCraft where it's a lot of it just comes down to me being able to be on my A game and execute stuff in a really crisp way. With Dota 2, there's a lot of big picture stuff that I still have to figure out. So that learning process is really fun. But then we've both been on the MOBA hype train with you playing Heroes of the Storm.
Yeah, it's not the best for my mental health, I think.
Yeah, they're definitely more salty of the gamer communities for sure. Actually just recorded a video on Friday when I was walking around outside talking about that experience of being berated by one of your teammates and how it's basically a long time tradition for MOBA games where any team that falls behind, you've got a certain role and you just kind of bash whoever's in that role for 20 minutes as your team is falling further and further behind, when really the whole scheme of your team was a collaborative effort, and if they're failing, you probably could have provided them more space and support. So yeah, it's an interesting space. I feel like a lot of my literature and talking points about mindset and respect for other people just isn't really integral to those gaming cultures at all. The StarCraft scene is a lot more so pro respect, but the Dota and League and Heroes of the Storm communities, yeah, talking shit, mad shit every time.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, I kind of want to get back to, in my head, I keep trying to push myself to get back into some of the older stuff. Castles and Kingdoms added carts recently, so that kind of got me interested again. I kind of want to try that out. And then I think Stellaris is adding yet another expansion. They're just always something new there. Oh, and you remember RimWorld, right?
Yeah.
They're adding a new expansion. That's always exciting. I think it's only like the third one, maybe the fourth one. You're going to be able to have kids now.
Huh.
Yeah, that's a big deal, actually. That's going to really ramp up the storytelling potential of a game that already has quite a bit. So that could be a lot of fun. I may have to just avoid that, because otherwise that could turn into a major time sink.
Yeah, if you want to recommend major time sink, Chad is saying play Dwarf Fortress.
I've heard of that. I've heard about that for a long time now, actually.
I've not played it.
Yeah, that's more of a role-playing type deal, right? I think that's the one I'm thinking of anyway. Yeah, very strong element there to that. From what I saw, I think I watched a video about it on YouTube once, and it looked very cool in terms of the depth of the storytelling and the random events that can happen and the way you can customize your characters and all the different things you can do in the game. It's very wide-ranging, so I was impressed. The graphics were not, well, they were archaic, but that's what I expect of a game with that many features. It's not always true, but in general, there's kind of an inverse relationship between game features and game graphics. Because, both of them are expensive, right? It takes money to design one or the other. So if you're putting money into your game mechanics, your graphics are probably going to suffer a little.
That applies to movies as well, though. Like, if you throw all of your budget at CGI, then you just have, like, nickels that you throw at the writers. And then you have, like, crap lines and scenes that look fantastical.
Too true.
I haven't seen Black Adam, but I've heard that it got that treatment where the combat looks amazing. It's really cool to see, but the lines are like super standard stock, unoffensive superhero movie that does stuff that's going to piss off as few people as possible, but doesn't really do anything ambitious or risky.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a trade-off. But for my part, I'm increasingly attracted to games that are ugly but have a lot of depth. That's actually, there was a game called Shadow Empires. I think that's what it was. And it's built like a tabletop, well, not tabletop, but it's built like a war game from the 1990s, like a really nerdy Matrix game type war game, with lots of tiles and just infinite mechanics of one kind or another. But it was released just a couple years ago. And instead of putting all of the, modern advances in graphics and whatnot and new technology to use, generating a really pretty image, they put all of that into new features and stuff. It's a very busy game. It's very complex, sometimes a little too much so. And it's only made by like one dude. So it's a little rough around the edges at times, but there's nothing else quite like it. It's actually pretty fun. So we'll recommend there for those of you who are more hardcore hex-style wargamers of one sort or another.
Nice. Well, I appreciate you coming on today, Mr. Agent Smith. Next week I will be off because I'll be returning from my trip to Oregon, but I hope you are healthy and well. 20-minute walk each week. I challenge you.
I did do it last week, but I don't think I got it in this Sunday. Yeah, too many chicken tenders, I guess.
Yeah, but actually you cut the sandwich, so.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true. That's $7 that my weight will not suffer.
Yeah. Appreciate you, chat, and we will see you all on the next episode of Will Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. Thanks for having me on. Always a privilege. See you next time.
GG. Nice.